Well, ladies and gentlemen, Dimitri is awesome. He is a fantastic thinker, a fantastic person, and a fantastic writer. And whenever he releases an article, it is an event, and one doesn't want to miss out. And Dimitri put out recently a paper on communization and absolute capital. You can find it on his Substack, Absolute Spirit, Actual Spirit, which is, again, just full to the brim with tremendous scholarship. I always enjoy speaking with Dimitri. He always brings a lot to the table that needs to be thought. It is always relevant, and it is always what we need to wrestle with, even if we don't want to wrestle with, which is exactly what we need to wrestle with. So Dimitri always does a wonderful job bringing those things together. I am indebted to Cadell Last for knowing Dimitri and the work that is done at Philosophy Portal. Dimitri's article is thinking about wrestling with Cadell Last's book, Real Speculation. So we will be referencing that and discussing it. You can find that book on Amazon. I highly suggest it. I had a series of wonderful discussions with Cadell about it. And you can also find Dimitri on Holy Cow with Daniel, had a wonderful conversation about this same Substack that I really suggest. But Dimitri, if I were to start, you have this wonderful word, communization versus communism. What's the difference there, Dimitri? What are we getting at?
Yeah, so communism is, of course, thank you, by the way, for having me here. I really appreciate that I can not only write about this, but that I have spaces in which I can speak about this, because I really think the truth of my writing is going to be in the conversations that are possible because of what I write. That's really my project here. So yeah, communization, communism, what's the difference? Why yet another word? So I would say that they are synonyms. They're synonyms, but with a different emphasis. So in the German ideology, Marx and Engels said that communism is the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. So they're not saying communism is is an ideal about the future society that will have to violently impose in an artificial way. No, communism, in a way, if we really take that quote seriously, already exists, if the real movement already exists. A real movement that does what? It abolishes the present state of things. And especially, I would say, it abolishes the capitalist social relationships, or you could say it abolishes value. Now, of course, we need to go into what that exactly means. So communization, for me, what I'm trying to bring out, communization is not my term. It's a term that has come up in communist history with different organizations, different people, most well known as left communists, which is they're kind of critiquing communism from the left. For them, things like Stalinism and Maoism were actually right wing, so to say. So communization really lays the emphasis on communism as the real movement. So instead, and so with these people talking about communization, what you can see is that they're very skeptical and critical of the idea that communism is about a party program and realizing that party program through a dictatorship of the proletariat. For communization means that the social revolution and the political revolution are already the real movement. They are already the production of communism. It is about how we relate right now and how we right now change those relationships politically. Are we overdetermined by capital, or is there something else? For example, family, which I try to hone in on in the article on different moments. Is the family safe from capital, or is it so let's say violently subdued by the necessities of capital that that like trauma comes about and families break apart, or that things happen which are not in the power of the family to solve. And that is also why at the same time communization is not only social revolution, although it is that, but it is also political revolution. So that's we can start there. Yeah.
Fantastic. I like also, so you have this wonderful emphasis on the vanishing mediator in good philosophy and good fiction,
Mhm.
which I appreciate the reference because I think about this all the time. The prerequisite for good fiction hinges upon the successful avoidance of the author to impose himself on the story. So you let the characters get a life of your own. I know you mentioned you had just been reading Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury,
Yeah,
which I'm incredibly
yeah.
partial to. Faulkner always talked about Caddy as if he was following her, as if he wanted to get to the mystery of Caddy. Like what was going on when she climbed the tree that day and the brothers all looked up and saw her in the tree. Like
Mhm.
he was like
Yeah.
Caddy was just, and he never gave Caddy a section in the book because he was too beautiful to give a section.
Mhm.
He couldn't bring her into a section. All he could do was circle her, right? And so Faulkner, I always like that because it's both kind of a vanishing mediator in the story, in a sense, to the brothers, and Faulkner himself is a kind of vanishing
Mhm.
mediator, right? That's going on. And it's very interesting because when you talk about communization as a real movement, there's a sense in which the difference that can occur is communization having this stress on the movement is less susceptible to falling into a master per se. There's always going to be some sort of mastering, some sort of big other, not to conflate those, but some sort of lack of a vanish. In communism, a mediator forms. It's not vanishing, right? People orbit around a cult of personality. And if you don't have this emphasis on the movement, then it's much more likely that you're going to end up failing to have a vanishing mediator. And in the same way that you get bad philosophy, if you don't have a vanishing mediator, you get bad fiction, so you get a bad politics, so you get a bad society. You need to have a vanishing mediator. But here's a problem. How do you have a vanishing mediator without a vanishing? You know, without everything just going away? Like, clearly, the author is somehow in the novel. The author is somehow in
Mhm.
the work, and yet they're not at the same time. This very odd bothness that has to be maintained. You know, Hegel is there and not, as you point out. Comparing Hegel with good fiction, I think, is extremely important. Um, and that seems to be also a critical question for this idea of communization versus communism. How is there a presence of subjectivity, if you grant me this way of phrasing it, a presence of subjectivity that the communization requires that is nevertheless a vanishing mediator? Because if it isn't,
Mhm.
then the recipe is there for someone to become the cult of personality, which continues to occur, and then
Mhm.
the whole thing sort of falls apart. So I really like this emphasis on the real movement that is now. It's imminent. It is not top down. I think that's so important. And I
Mhm.
do think that ultimately requires us to think the value form, which, in my opinion, many more Marxist thinkers go
Yeah.
over too quickly. They go over it way too quickly, and they say the labor theory of value. And that's all well and good. Now, I have my own personal take on that, where if we look at how, everyone talks about obviously volume one, but I think the very beginning of volume one is very interesting because it is very
Mhm.
critical that the value form comes to be in commodity. But to reduce the value form just to the exchange value seems incorrect. And yet at the same time, the value seems to be determined by labor, but does that mean it equals labor? What is the relationship of value? And of
Mhm.
course, under capitalism, the idea is the only valuation, the only value form will be the commodity, which is the abstract social use of labor. But then there's still a question of how does the value form become that? How does it get captured that way and experienced that way? And that opens a lot for me that I'll pause before going into, because I think when you're emphasizing this real movement, the value form is now, it is present, and there's some sort of instability in the value form that actually needs to be poked at, that needs to be kind of ruptured
Yeah.
and brought out. Perhaps a hint to thinking this problem is where you mentioned with Cadell. Cadell has erased himself from the picture, but not despite, but because of including the subjects within his thought. Hence, the universal history of thought as New Age atheist historicity is grounded in that very paradox of the contingent decision of the reflexive subject, which retroactively establishes necessity. This seems very interesting to me because there's something about this that seems to be the way that the subject carries themselves in communization that actually lends itself in the
Mhm.
direction
Yeah.
of the real moment versus communism. I will pause. I have more to say Another thing I love is this line: to enact real speculations is to write out of context. So if you'd like to comment on that or on anything that we've said, please go right ahead, Dimitri.
Yeah, thanks. So before getting into the weeds of the value forum, which is indeed, it's so central to a critique of political economy and to think what do we actually want politically and what is actually happening. But to go back, so I start the article. Writing about real speculations. That's also originally that was the idea with the article. I was very excited with the release of Real Speculations, so I wanted to write a response to it, and then I so one of the things that I focus on in the article is new atheist historicity. And you've talked about this with Cadell on your channel, of course. People will be familiar with this probably, but I just want to summarize. So new atheist historicity is Cadell's superimposed the scheme of the phenomenology of spirit on, let's say, pop intellectual figures of the 21st century, especially in regards to religion, right? So we have reason being embodied by Richard Dawkins, we have a spirit being embodied by Sam Harris, and then we have religion being embodied by Jordan Peterson. Now, speaking for myself, but for me, when I now look at these figures, I cannot really unsee the fact that they embody these spiritual forms. And I could tell someone about this and they could agree with me and not know Cadell at all. At the same time, I'm very confident to say that only someone like Cadell Last could make such an analysis of these thinkers in this Hegelian way that he did. But so you mentioned writing out of context. But an orthodox Hegelian, or maybe a supporter of Peterson, Harris, or Dawkins could come around and look at this analysis and be like, wait, this is not only strange, this is baffling or ridiculous, or this is crazy, this is madness. What are you doing with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit? Or what are you doing with these figures, thinking these together in this way? I think we can both agree that it's very much an illuminating and clarifying analysis. So, but Cadell also says in his Real Speculations that all these figures basically disavow the dimension of Marxism because they are all united against woke. But then what I'm saying in my article is that we can see that actually these figures and woke, from the Marxist perspective, are all on the side of capital, right? And this is really the problem that we have to think. This is the problem. This is where real speculations should go to. Now, of course, Cadell's super aware of that. That's why he's having the Marx course right now. And that's why we're diving into Marx with Philosophy Portal. And at the same time, in the book Real Speculations, we can see that Cadell says in the book that he points to the lack of real speculations. And the lack of real speculations is really to think an emancipatory socialist project. I believe that's a wording that he would be comfortable with. And so for me, communization really works within that lack of real speculations. It's attempting to respond to that lack of real speculations, not to set real speculations aside, but to try really to radicalize real speculations and what we take that to be. I'm very much working within not only the spirit of Cadell, but also like him working within the spirit of Zizek and these philosophical traditions of Hegel, psychoanalysis, German idealism, psychoanalysis, and Marxism. Yeah.
No, I love all of that. And you wrote in your article, one thing that I've always found special about Last's philosophical performativity is the lack of fixity to adherence of theoretical edifices of modern philosophy. And along with a keen eye to the personalization of these dense theories without losing out on rigorous fidelity. I think this is actually very important because I'm not sure if you can do this if you can't function as a vanishing mediator. Someone who is not a vanishing mediator is precisely one that tends to fall into a certain fixicity to the adherence of theoretical edifices. And arguably, the problem between communism and communization is a fixity to theoretical edifices, the inability to actually let them move into, to have a lack of fixity, right? And so it's very interesting to me as well that if there's something about the subject themselves that has to, in order to have new social relations, has to be more of a vanishing mediator than not, and I'd have to, then a quality of that person will be a lack of fixity to the adherence of the theoretical edifices, quote unquote, or worldviews or religions or whatever they're operating in. And I think when you speak of Peterson, I'll just use that as an example because he represents religion. It looks as if Peterson lacks a fixity to adherence of the theoretical edifices because he's always talking about the hero and the dragon, chaos and order. It looks like there's a lack of fixity. But this is the problem with a dichotomy, I'm going to say a dichotomy versus a dialectic. Like a dichotomy is fixed. There's order, there's chaos. Just because there's movement in the fixity does not mean that it's not nevertheless fixed. And it's fixed by overdetermination by capital, because no one is questioning that. In order to actually have a lack of fixity, you're going to have B in A, not A versus B, order. You're going to have order create chaos, chaos create order in its own unfolding, right? And that's the movement, of course, as I'll talk about, between, religion to absolute knowing. Also, I think you mentioned Jordan Peterson appears, he has the performatism. There was a movement, Greg Denber will talk about this in his book on metamodernism, where a response to postmodernism was a performanism, I think it's what it's called. It's this idea of let us perform as if the thing is true, even though we don't believe it. So that is very interesting to me because I am not saying any way whatsoever that Jordan Peterson is equivalent to Paul Tillich in the way I'm about to describe, because he seems to very much love his wife and they went through hell with her cancer. So I'm not making this critique. But what's very interesting is I think of Peterson a lot with Paul Tillich. And Paul Tillich has this notion of ultimate concern, which is the idea that you must believe in God even if you don't, because everyone has an ultimate concern. Paul Tillich talks a lot about the courage to be. It is, in my opinion, remarkably similar to Peterson. And I actually think we are getting thinkers like Paul Tillich because we actually haven't thought Paul Tillich enough. And the thing we haven't thought about Paul Tillich enough is his sex life, because he was sleeping around like crazy. He was groping students. He was a terrible human being. And this is the great problem, is that I think Paul Tillich is an indication that religion without absolute knowing cannot sublimate libido. And it's going to lead to the perverted, as you will get into and Cadell talks about. We have a perverted society today. Well, Paul Tillich would have shown you that. And the reason why I think Paul Tillich is so important is because even if Jordan Peterson himself is not perverted, which I do not take him to be at all, the ultimate concern that Mr. Peterson is putting down could ultimately contribute to perversion. Now, I'd have to make this case, but Paul Tillich is an indication of that, because religion is not enough to deal with the libido. And you could ultimately argue, and this is just my take, is that basically the stakes of communization is dealing with the issue of the libidinal, and that's of course the theopolitical, as Cadell has emphasized, and that I think you're bringing out. And of course, the problem is, if you fall into communism, you're dealing with perversion with neurotic. You're going back to a cult of personality, and that's going to then have eventually there will be a response to that, back to the perverted or the psychosis, and a war against it, and then it just kind of will go back. You have to stay in the movement itself. Well, the movement itself is going to be A entails B in the unfolding, right? It's always going to be unfolding. And if you don't have that different logical structure, then you're always going to be at best in religion. And if you're in religion, the best you can do is something like Paul Tillich, which, again, it was actually devastating for me to find out the truth of Paul Tillich, because I was really into his work. I was using it all the time. I was thinking it through. And then I found out from his friend Niebuhr, in the biography on Niebuhr, that Tillich was a very questionable, he was a pervert in a very hard, and worse yet, he rationalized it as good. It was a realization of he seems to have brought it into his philosophy as a making authentic of the individual. And we see that. We see that not in Peterson, but in other people who are returning to religion without thinking capital, without thinking that logic. So I think, and the thing I also was just going to say is that because Cadell is bringing himself, you make this very interesting move of, since he himself is on ground zero of his thought, you would think that wouldn't create a vanishing mediator, but that precisely does create a vanishing mediator when you base it on the individual. And that also allows there to be thinking that wouldn't have occurred, because the thinking Cadell is bringing is outside the fixed edifice of theoretical thinking. And so there's something here about the individual themselves bringing themselves into their own thinking that seems to be critical for the average subject to function as a certain vanishing mediator to their own worldview, to their own thinking, which if they don't do, they can't be in the movement of Geist, the movement of spirit, the movement of history, right? Because they're just going to be, they're not going to be moving with it. So I guess this is the question. I'd be curious any reactions to any of this. Is part of the issue, because now I can't help but look at the value form, because to me the value form conversation is like everything. It's all going to come down to that. And so I really appreciate your article, because this is an obsession of mine and belonging again. So wonderful. Is there something about the commodity, so when I say commodity, I'm also going to mean by that in this conversation, the manifestation of the value form as commodity, where it is in the value form, right? So is there something about the commodity that keeps the individual from being a vanishing mediator in their own worldview and in their own strength? And that seems to also be constantly occurring, because the commodity form is often placing you as the subject in relation to the commodity form. You really can't kind of forget yourself because you've got bills to pay. You've got to figure out how you're going to situate yourself within the logic of capital. That was a thought that may be entirely off base, but I'd be curious any of your response to any of that, from Tillich to Peterson to that, or anything.
Yeah, that's explosive. There's a lot there. So I think the religion question is interesting, because it's evident that religion is making a comeback. More people are converting all over the place to different identifications. And actually, I think becoming a radical leftist should be included in that. People are also there. Let's say we live in a type of liberal democracy, and there is a crisis of meaning. We could put it like that, or we could say that people are being hollowed out by capital. We can also put it like that. This drives them to a sense of meaning that is more than what is given. More than what is given. So when I had such a thing, and I grew up in an atheist household, and so I never had this sense of religion is my home. I was when I was an early teen, I was watching YouTube videos and seeing Richard Dawkins and being like, oh, this guy is so rational. Like, obviously religion is stupid and archaic and should just be thrown out. That was me saying that. So coming from that, with the 2016 election and this type of new atheist thinking, for me, that collided in a way that I couldn't sustain myself as like a rational humanist, because I think that's what you're left with Richard Dawkins. You're left with humanism, enlightenment thinking that if there's no God, well, what's left? The human. So it's implicit, but there's still a faith in the human, and also in the rationality of the human. So I think that is actually also that is really the leftist, wherein the leftist tradition should be located, a type of humanism. And of course, there's a whole discussion in Marxism of, is Marx a humanist, is he not? The younger Marx generally is taken to be more of a humanist. But I would say that also humanism is a type of religious edifice, right? It works with faith, it works with ideas, and I'm reminded by Cadell's observations that new atheist conferences and humanist organizations, they are very unsustainable. Like, it seems that the human organization, we can't really rely on the idea that all there is humans. We need some big other to refer to. That, you know, at the bottom of it all, it's God. At the bottom of it all, it's these holy scriptures. It's these fundamental rituals that are structured in these ways. And like, we can talk about a lot of things, but that is what we're staying with. And I think that, in a way, real speculations and from a communist vantage point, religion and spirituality and reason, they all, how would I say this? They all seem to, they're all already religious in a way that they don't admit to be, namely the religion of capitalism. And this religion of capitalism, we are always already acting out. And I'm very adamant about the fact that, you know, you can say you're anti-capitalist, you can say you're post-capitalist or socialist or whatever word you can make up, but what are you, like, how are you related to the commodity in your daily life? Like, what do you do? Like, what boundaries do you have? Or what boundaries does your town, your nation, you know, these type of things have? Like, in education, are you in an education system that is capitalist or not? Do you have to have debt to get an education? Like these, and like, because that, you know, in German and Dutch, debt and guilt are the same word. And that weighs very heavily on you, right? Because you're guilty, because your future, you have to work, you know, that you have to work your closed future off. Like, it's not yours. The future is not yours when you are in debt. You have to work this up at the behest of someone else who is there. So this is religion. Like, this is religion. This is religion. That's what the communist is saying. So and even, like, if we don't want to call it religion, because it's we can see it's religious. It's a religious type of activity. Like, we're religiously acting this out. We're religiously relating in such ways. So Zizek will say that we live in a perverted age, and one of the markers of this is shamelessness. So, as you already pointed out, it's with Tillich. So it's not only that you have that you're hurting people by being promiscuous in a way that, you know, also hurts these people, and also hurted Paul Tillich. Like, let's be honest. Like, it's not like he had the full enjoyment there. Like, he was probably very tormented by having to have sex with all these people and having to touch them, and like, right, like, for the sex addict, even though they have too much sex, they feel as if they have too little sex. And love is not in the picture at all, which is very tragic, obviously. But yeah, as you said, Tillich not only acted this out, but he justified it. He said, actually, you know, if you read closely, then it will all be clear to you too. But this is perversion, right? It's not only you're doing something that's bad in the simple sense, but you're also saying, no, actually, it's good. And that's really something that I also want to give a simple example with perversion that we can see today, and that also should make us question, like, are we living in simple capitalism, or is something else happening? Which is something I'm trying to touch in my article, like the question of Varoufakis, like, maybe capitalism is already dead. Maybe we already live in techno-feudalism. So I really wanted to leave that question open, but at the same time really work with it and not just stay in a relativist position. And so a simple example here would be how social media functions. So generally, if you have a Facebook account or Instagram page or Twitter, you made a nice picture, and then you're like, okay, now I'm going to post it because it's a nice picture. Or you post something in your story, or you tweet something. But then the perverted twist is that then the perverted twist becomes like, I want to have something posted in my story, I want to have tweeted something, I want to have posted something, and therefore I should find things in real life to post. And so this becomes its own self-driving mechanism. It just doesn't become, look at my real life, but it becomes of like, look at how my real life is, like, let's say, in tandem or synchronous with the rhythm of the algorithm. right? And that type of ritual, because it is a ritual, this type of ritual that we, might act out on a daily basis, weekly basis, whatever we have. This is really also how I want to think capitalism and communization. Like what are the rituals that we act out? And this is, so you can see immediately that the question of singularity, the question of what do you do in your own life becomes crucial. But at the same time, you can't ignore the social. So it's not just like you have to be like, you have to clean your room or you have to buy ecologically responsible products. But it's like, okay, well, of course, greenwashing is a huge thing as well. So it's not as simple as that, and really staying with the fact that whether I say I believe in capitalism or not, I act it out. I enact capitalism, and I do this, and there's no, I don't have to morally flagellate myself or others for buying tons of commodities or living in lavish lives. I don't think the communist critique of capitalism is about that at all. I don't want to eat the rich. I know this has been one of the popular radical leftist slogans, but I think really I'm also trying to short circuit that and to move away from let's say a moral critique of capitalism, because again we are already religiously acting capitalism out. Yeah.
Well, very well put. I think people, communism has a community. We hear the word communism and it's separated from the question of the possibility of community. The issue is the question of community being the mediator of social relations is very difficult because we as human beings tend to hate each other, especially if we're different. So the dream, like the proper understanding of communization, is some ability for humans to maintain social relations reliant on a third that doesn't commoditize them or that, compress them or flatten.
Yes.
So
Exactly.
what is, because there's a few things. There's this idea that you pointed out that we always seem to have to rely on some kind of big other, something like that.
Yes.
You quoted Zizek, where he said something basically on the lines of, we can't handle freedom except through something. Freedom can't be too direct. There has to be a mediation of freedom or we're destroyed, right? Well, that almost seems right there to be game over for, communization, right? Because if we require a mediation of freedom, isn't that it? Isn't it over? This is the problem. And the issue is perhaps there is a desire to believe communism would be achieved by eating the rich, because the difficulty of this challenge would be over. You wouldn't have to face it, right? We're literally talking about some possibility of a mediation of freedom that doesn't reinstate a cult of personality or a enclosed neurotic, right? Well, what in the world does that mean? We're looking at something like Joyce's symptom, right? But how do you spread the conditions of symptom, right? Or childhood, et cetera, so forth. Isn't that impossible? Well, if it can't be done, then communization seems to be in trouble, right? Oh, but one of the arguments that I like to make in Belonging Again is that we are seeing even capitalism seems to be falling into stagnation. Its growth operations are not there. Perhaps you could make a strong argument.
Exactly.
The Austrian could come around and say, okay, guys, totally agree. Totally agree that there's problems with social relations being mediated by commodity. There's problems with that. But otherwise, we kill each other, and it is, non-zero sum, right? Everyone's getting richer. What's the issue? Thomas Sowell would say, you guys, you need to understand the tragic sense of life. You need to have a constrained vision, not an unconstrained vision, because the unconstrained vision that believes in the possibility of social mediation without commodity just gets everyone killed, and it always becomes Stalinism, if you will, right? It always becomes a cult of personality. Like the Austrian critique would be to say something like this. It would be, in my opinion, if I were to take a Rothbard and people like that, they would say something like, okay, yes, in theory, it's possible to make a society that social relations are not mediated by commoditization. But practically speaking, every time, because people can't figure out how to do that, especially if they're different. Oh, crap. So you can do this if you're fascist. You can do this if there's a self-similarity, but that's a problem. But if you want to avoid, and that's why communism becomes fascism, because it always falls back on some sort of principle of socialization that isn't commodity. Well, if you don't want that to be nationalism, race, or something problematic, then you better be able to handle pluralism. And we are very bad at that. Well, then it's going to fall into fascism, basically. So that's why it keeps doing that. And Coratani would talk about, well, that's all part of the design of the capital nation state, actually. The capital wants efforts of the communism to fail. And then fascism comes along, and that just keeps the triplex going. Now, that would be another discussion, but for Coratani, that's all exactly on schedule. So, of the triplex, of the capital nation state. And of course, the only way for him to, I want to say, sublate the capital nation state into something else is going to be mode of exchange for X, the X variable, beyond. And that, of course, is going to bring us to a conversation of the value form. And I do have partiality. I do like Coratani because he also emphasizes the value form as being very important, and saying that there's not enough emphasis on the mode of exchange, the exchange act himself. Now, does Coratani ultimately address the issue? Well, he basically says we have to, or we're all going to die. And I'm not sure if that's an address. He kind of ends it saying, well, we're going to have a perpetual peace because we'll kill each other if we don't. And well, I'd like to think we could do a little better than that. That seems to be a little risky, especially with drone technology. And I don't think Coratani knows Nick Land, and that would be another variable to bring into the discussion. But the thing I was going to say, this is just a very good paper because it's getting at everything, is that
yeah, yes. I tried, at least I tried.
You did it. This is the paper on communization and absolute capitalism. I was going to ask you, because you talk about it in the paper, on what is absolute capitalism versus other descriptions of capitalism. I really think this is important because it also points to the centrality of the value form question, in my opinion. But the thing I was going to, I have so many notes, that is the idea that, okay, social humans in their freedom require a third. I'm going to just say the third, the mediation. They require a third. How can that be done without ultimately falling into an enclosure, an neurotic, something like capital, something that's ultimately going to have our social relations done for us? Because it would seem as if communization would require for us to do our social relations, not to outsource them. We have to do our social relations. But isn't that impossible? Can't we not handle the freedom? I'd be curious, before I continue talking for 30 minutes, I'd be curious if that framing of the problem strikes, or how maybe to reword it, or any reactions you have to anything that was said.
No, I think this is really good. How do we think about social relations that are not done for us, but it is up to us? It is our responsibility. Because what is happening now in absolute capitalism is that it is done for us. In other words, it is outside of our control. But I think the impossible gesture that I'm trying to point at is like, we have to realize that it is out of our control, and still we have to take responsibility for it. We have to take responsibility that we are letting, in a way, we are letting it be done for us, and then we have to face up to that. And I think really this is also the psychoanalytic moment, that because symptoms are okay. So let me say it like this. So we recently read Mladendolar's A Voice and Nothing More, and at the very end of the book, he has a chapter about Kafka, and I think Kafka, I'm there to say, provides the perfect model for subjective destitution with his book, especially with his story on the dog. And so what happens is there is a starving dog, and he hears a song. That's really that's how Dolar ends the very his book. So this dog is starving. He hears a song, then he sees a hound, which he doesn't. You don't know if that hound really exists or if it's a vision, or it's totally opaque. Then it turns out that the hound is singing that song, and I mean, you can have tons of associations and readings, but what I would say, what I would like to say is that this is in a way psychoanalysis, in that there is a song, there is a certain enjoyment, a certain play, which is not really, it's not like you are doing it, but it comes from nowhere, then you can ascribe it to the other, and then you have to see yourself as doing that. Like you are externalized in that song to which you can only ascribe to the other. In other words, you are there and you are not there. And this is the wild thing about enjoyment, right? Because enjoyment is when we lose control. It's like, that's why it's summer now and people like to go to festivals. Why? Because to lose themselves, right? Let's take some ecstasy because all these rituals of capitalism, like I just want to lose myself, right? We all want to lose ourselves, and that loss of oneself, like, well, what's left if there's no self? Well, that's the other. That's the enjoyment of the other, and that is in a way done for you. So nothing against ecstasy or festivals, by the way, like you do you, and but yes, working like that. So communize in the title, the title of the paper, I thought about it for quite a long time, and I really think everything in a way is already in the title, because communization is not, it's not a, communization is about communism, and therefore it is about the beyond of capitalism. At the same time, it's communization in absolute capitalism. So as soon as we say we are the special ones that are already kind of outside capital, that's a mistake. I think that's a mistake. I think as soon, and then you get to what you mentioned with Koratani, and a lot of other communists have also put it in different ways, that things that you claim or things that you try to do outside or against capital become part of the movement of capital, right? And so the capital drive is this movement that is being done for us, and that we are not in control of, right? Like if you maybe you can try to vote on things, but you live in capitalism, you have to get a contract, if you have to sell your wage labor, or if you have property, if you have capital, then you have to invest. You have to, presumably, right? Like if we take the Austrian picture seriously, there's a general tendency to invest and accumulate capital in this way. So yeah, I want to say two things. So one of them is that when I was young, I went into a communist organization. It was a Maoist organization, and at a certain point, especially with COVID, I left it because I retracted, and I did not. I mean, I always had my doubts when I was there, but then it basically exploded, and it was unsustainable for me to stay there. And I remember when I left that. These people didn't say to me, okay, well, you're leaving, we respect that, that's it. But they were quite, they felt attacked. And, I was naive because I was very surprised. I thought that if you're a communist and you are, let's say, already critical of capitalism, you're already, you're a bit alienated from everyone, but like, because you're critical and you see that something that others don't see, or at least that's how you experience it, right? I thought that, these people might also be more open generally, but that's not what I saw. I saw there is a certain opening, right? You become, let's say, religious, spiritual, philosophical, artistic, because you have an openness, right? Because you see something that others don't, and then you make a song out of it, or a poem, or you start, seeing the truth of these holy scriptures that are just like words for other people, right? And for me, that was as a teenager again, the Communist Manifesto. Also what Noam Chomsky was a huge influence to me in my teenage years, because he's repeatedly pointing out, look, imperialism is happening. Look, what is like said is being done is not really like I don't know. When I would talk to people about this type of stuff as a teen, they would say, well, of course America's good, like America's is our body, and stuff like this. So I was like, wow, like people are so they don't know what's happening, and that kind of drove me to feel more alienated, and then seek out people that are also saw the same thing, right? So yeah, that's what drove me to become active. But then the whole communist thing that I was in, there was a certain type of enclosure there, right? And I was preoccupied with certain questions that weren't meant to be asked, let me put it like this, which is why I eventually had to leave. Even though I felt like they addressed me in one way, I didn't feel like they addressed really the questioning that stemmed from that from that point. So and if I look back at it and see it now, I do think that they were assuming that the social relations will be in a way done for us in communism, but it will be a good way that it will be done for us, right? Not a capitalist bourgeois way, because it will be a way in which everyone has seen that type of truth. And in one of the words that I come with in this article, which is a word that is both political, it's also really like economic, and it's also metaphysical and psychoanalytic, and that word is proletarization.
Mm.
So the only way that communization happens, and it does happen, and it is a real movement, is proletarization. And what is proletarization? So the proletariat is not, to speak in the Marxist sense, the proletariat is not the most oppressed class in capitalism. The proletariat is a special type of contradiction that is as Chris Catrone describes it, the proletariat, the word itself comes from the Roman times, which means someone that is a proletarian citizen is someone who is a citizen, but he does not have any property, right? So you're assumed to be able to go inside of civil society, bourgeois social relationships, liberal social relationships, but you don't have the means to actually do that. For example, you're assumed to have a car, to have education, to own a house, to start a family, but you cannot do this because maybe you're just from a poor family, man. Like maybe the life has been destroyed, and that's impossible. So that's in a way that's where the working class is at. And as Gary Stevenson and many others are pointing out, the middle class is increasingly being on a fragile ground, is being proletarianized. But proletarization is not only that. So proletarization is also really getting to the core of a contradiction in an edifice in which you are not addressed, so to say.
Yes.
So in that way, to be proletarized as, let's say, a liberal individual or an individual who doesn't ask questions by capitalism might make you a communist. But then, as I said before, saying I'm a communist, being in a communist organization, doing activism, might also just be totally aligned with the movement of capital. So the claim by basically Paul Matic, who is a self-proclaimed left communist, is that Marxism itself should be proletarized. Marxism itself should be proletarized. And that means that Marxism has to address something which it didn't address before, really. It's like it didn't really address it because it couldn't, because it wasn't thoroughly proletarized already. And one of the things I say in the article to clarify the term proletarization is that proletarization is hystericization. So in a way, let's say you live in capitalism, but you don't function properly within capital, right? And that makes you hysterical. Why can't I do the things that everyone around me seems to do? Or why, I'm working so hard, why I'm like not getting rich or barely getting by? So many people are just working hard, barely getting by, working for, not even working for money and barely getting by, but still having to work for no money. Like these things make us so hysterical, right? And so these things make us super hysterical, and that is proletarization. And communization is a response to this. So communization has to start from that position, but at the same time, it doesn't say hysteria is the answer. It doesn't say that. What hysteria does, hysteria is basically pointing out perversion. That is, that you can, the hysteric asks, who am I for you? Or tell me who I am for you. Because I don't seem to exist, maybe, or I don't seem to fit in, right? I cannot be addressed. So tell me, like, address me. Address me. And that's the proletariat. This is really the core of the proletarian subjectivity. I claim. And yeah, so communization only happens from that standpoint. And so it's about a fidelity to singularity. I'll stop. I'll stop there.
Oh, it's so good. I think it. So, um, if we're if we're gonna take responsibility for our social relationships are up to us. Um, we can view each stage of the phenomenology, the phenomenological journey that Cadell talks about as what is the third. I'm just going to say the third. So on the level of reason, the third is reason. Social relations will be mediated through reason. In Sam Harris' Spirit, it will be mediated through spirit. And in religion, it will be mediated through religion. But of course, if religion cannot deal with the problem of perversion, in closure, it's either going to have a neurotic or a perversion. Then we have an issue. So what would it mean to make the third absolute knowing? What exactly would that mean, right? Because that's the question. Because what's interesting is if absolute knowing has something about a lack to it, this seems to address the problem of needing a third to mediate freedom between people without it being over people. Because that's ultimately, it seems the only way we can do social relationships is to have the third between us versus over us, or deal with it by enclosing off from the other, right? So the third has to be between. And something that seems unique about absolute knowing is it is fundamentally a between. It is based on a certain between because it's based on an encounter, a limitation, becoming other, some sort of metaxis, as to use Desmond's term, who I know Luber has been speaking of and I've listened to. But that between space is really, really important. But of course, between is unstable. Between is weird. Between can shock you and surprise you, and something could come out of it that's unexpected. And why would you take responsibility for that? Screw that. I don't want to take responsibility for Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses, but we have to. The only possibility of communization is a certain responsibility of the between, which is the lack. But that means you're taking responsibility for something that you don't know you're taking responsibility for. Because if you did, it would be a presence, not a lack. It would be a thing, not a between, right? And why would you ever do that? What rational reason would you ever do that? Why would you do that? If you can get enjoyment from perversion or enjoyment in religion, why would you bother to do this thing, right? Well, to me, that's going to get into things like obviously absolute choice. And there would have to be some glimpse or glimmer or some sort of experience that would suggest that this is worth it, or et cetera, so forth. And maybe the experience is seeing fascism come back or something, or the not being able to afford a house. Maybe these are the forcing functions to make us take seriously a between space that otherwise we would not. And then if that's the case, which to some degree it does seem to be the case, this would also suggest why thought cannot get ahead of history. Because until this moment in history, you simply couldn't take the between space seriously, even if you wanted to, because you didn't have history in the moment of now basically make that something that's fitting to do, because there would have been adequate alternatives until this moment. But at this moment, I am of the view it is necessary, even though there seems to be a unique difficulty and even danger to doing this, right? Because if this between space, like if we are literally going to take responsibility for our social relations and we're bad at it, then we may kill each other. Which, why would you do this if everything else on offer is working? Well, if we're at the stage where everything else on offer is also going to get us to kill ourselves, then this way, or to be erased or replaced by the AI, then this space of great negativity is at this historical moment, is the right thing to take on. I'll speak with Javier Jockin and different people about beauty, and we talk a lot about beauty, but the problem with beauty is if you screw up beauty, you get evil. You get the worst of all possible things. Like, beauty is a very intense, like, there's a lot of people talking about the wonders and the mystical experience and all that. You F up beauty, you're dealing with Lucifer. Like, the highest stage, like, if you mess up the good, you get the bad. You mess up the true, you get the false. But you mess up beauty, you get evil. And this between space of the absolute knowing, I do locate beauty there. Now, I'd have to go into that. But it's very intense. If you want to talk Dante, you've also got to talk Lovecraft. And so this is a very dangerous thing, but it seems necessary. But I can't help but also, you mentioned Kafka, who absolutely is the thinker of subjective destitution and the thinker of, ultimately I associate discourse and belonging again to one with Kafka. and rhetoric with voicecraft that Tim is doing, and belonging again to, we're just going to use the language Kafka-likeness versus voicecraft, which will be referencing Delar in your work, but also bringing it with Tenad in this issue of the mediation of the communicative act, which of course is deeply psychoanalytical. The alternative to that is something Kafka-like. Kafka is absolutely constantly exploring the ways that the mind itself structures itself to its own imprisonment, to its own execution, and there is a certain, sometimes, envy of animals. Animals play a big role in Kafka. There is the hunger artist with the panther that everyone seems to love, and no one's paying attention to the hunger artist anymore. Obviously, finally, Gregory gets out of work by turning into a bug. The one day he doesn't have to go to work, he's hated by everything he was going to work for, his family, right? And then, of course, a key final line of the trial by Kafka is like a dog when he's executed, right? Which I strongly connect with investigations of a dog. Because there's an idea that could the dog get out of it? Now, what's so important about investigations of a dog is the character also ends up in almost a Pynchon novel, a certain paranoia. Did I imagine it? What was going on? He gets into this kind of investigation. An investigation can be a enclosed model that can deal with the problem of desire, because you have this thing to investigate, right? You have this Pynchon novel. I call it the Pynchon risk. This thing that you can always be looking into it. We see it in the movies of Cohn, like Paranoia Agent or Millennial Actress. How do we just have this ever thing to experience? And you can do that with a conspiracy, with something that you can always investigate that you never get to the end of. And this seems to be a way you can avoid ending up like Joseph K. if you can find this investigation, right? So here's the issue. The dog who experiences these hounds singing, that's a glimmer of the beautiful, if you will, a glimmer that seems to be needed for drive. But here's something that I think is really important. If we're going to be talking about the between space and drive, drive is not inherently good. Drive can be directed toward a Pynchon novel. It can be directed. A strike of beauty, mysticism could just lead to religion without absolute knowing, right? If it doesn't have the logical form by which to capture, by which to mediate the mystical. The problem is, because I'm just associating the song of the dog with the mystical, a glimpse of the mystical without the logical form of AB is actually just going to end up not in absolute knowing, and actually could just end up in a certain paranoia or a certain Pynchon risk or something like that, right? So you have to have the logical form, and the argument could be the commodity form as it currently stands basically does not allow that. It gets in the way of bringing that into our social relations. So basically, we have to end up like a character in Kafka of some form, even if we have the mystical vision, even if we see the beautiful, even if we don't have to go to work. And I think the metamorphosis is very important, because that is a story of basically all of us are bugs, actually, when we don't go to work. Like, that's kind of the revelation. There's a question of why does Gregory become a bug, right? And he's not really a roach. He's more of a different creature. He's described as a roach, but he's more monstrous. It's kind of different. Kind of one of the revelations of the real or, subjective destitution is all of us are pretty not nice, right? And so if we don't, so there's kind of this idea in the metamorphosis that the reason Gregory doesn't have to go to work is because he becomes a bug. But what if not going to work is why he's a bug? Because that's when you don't have something to mediate yourself and you have to confront the reality of yourself, right? And that's part of the issue, is that the commodity form actually helps us avoid all our negativity, helps us avoid the problem of desire, the problem of our own desires, right? So there's a suggestion, like there's always this play. Kafka is absolutely a novelist of the problem of desire, the problem of how to deal with these things. And Kafka is pointing out that everything you think will deal with it is not going to deal with it, that we do not have a proper address. And it's also very important that Kafka novels have a logic of the dream. The stories have a dream quality into how they unfold. This is very important. The whole thing is psychoanalysis in very profound ways. So basically, if you want to talk about communization, you have to respond to Kafka. You have to be able to respond to Kafka. And if you can't respond to Kafka, you're dreaming. This is not going to work. You're going to end up executed. The revolution will simply end up in its own termination, or in a Pynchon novel, like Crying of Lot 49, which I associate with the investigation of the dog. But there's so many more things to say. I think, so we have to somehow, well, this is, I guess, what I'm also dealing with, what we see in Kafka. is that, so we'll put it generally that there's the problem of desire. Like desire, we're always running from it. We don't want to own our desires. And basically, capitalism comes along and says, well, we know how we're going to deal with the problem of desire. We're going to give people objects that they can consume. We'll say, well, they'll give them objects, they'll direct the desire toward that, and it will contain them. Now, in many respects, if we have no way or have no idea how to deal with the problem of desire, which ultimately is the problem of social relations, because desire always comes out in social relations, and desire is what destroys social relations if you're not careful. If we have no idea on how to move the average person to absolute knowing, to deal with the problem of desire, then capitalism's pretty great, actually. Because it can decentralize the problem of desire, break it up from unifying into a big thing, and everyone is going to go for their objects. And here's also a key characteristic. You know, this whole idea, Lacan and other psychoanalysis, that the object of desire never fulfills you? That's a feature, because here's why. If the object fails, capitalism can say, well, that's your fault. You can't blame the system. It becomes your fault, and you can't take it out on others. So guilt contains the rage of desire. It contains the problem of desire by making you enclose yourself in a guilt because you didn't make enough money to get the bigger house or the bigger car, right? So what you're doing in that is, by the mechanism of the object of desire, you're putting the feeling of failure on the individual, which decentralizes it from networking into this entire society, which would be a Lovecraft creature, right? And so guilt is a feature to keep the problem of desire from destroying the entire system, right? But of course, that doesn't sound good. But one of the ways that religions dealt with this is why capitalism plus religion, say Christianity, can go together. Because if people feel guilty, well, you can be forgiven of your sins, though. You can confess, and actually you can go to church, and even if you can't get the big house, you can have a certain spiritual status nonetheless. Well, you put those things together, and you have a system that works pretty good. Because the guilt traps you, the feeling of never getting what you want, is eating you alive. But then in church, if actually, well, that's just because the world has fallen, and actually you can still have spiritual status. You can still have status by acknowledging that. Well, then that all kind of goes together, right? But then if reason comes along, as Cadell talks about, and destroys, well, it's ridiculous and destroys religion, well, now the problem of desire erupts. And that's what Peterson is talking about, right? Okay, now you have the problem of desire. Also, I will note, and this is where I'll speak of techno-feudalism, the mechanism of desire addressing, now the object of desire addressing the problem of desire, I'm going to say, that only works until people see it. They see the game. They see what's going on. Once they become aware, wait a minute, capitalism's trying to train us to want things that actually aren't going to make us happy, and it's all a ruse and it doesn't work, right? Well, screw that. Oh no, then the problem of desire starts to get unleashed. So a new form of capitalism emerged. Hey man, it's not about desires, it's about experiences. It's about entrepreneurship. It's about creativity. And there has absolutely been a transformation in the mechanism of dealing with the problem of desire between capitalism and capitalism today, which I also align with techno-feudalism, because techno-feudalism is another strategy to deal with the problem of desire, right? And what you're doing is moving it from the object of desire, per se, which that mechanism doesn't work anymore, to almost the experience of desire, which then is more likely actually to create perversion, because what is perversion but a certain sort of experience of desire that is kind of enclosed, and it says this is good in of itself, and don't encounter anything that would suggest otherwise, right? So you have this mechanism of dealing with the inability of desire ever dying, because desire is invincible. It's just going to go on forever. You're dealing it by hooking it up in experiencing, hooking it up in self-realization, and that seems great, right? What's the problem with that? Well, because that's it then. This is it. This is the final step of how we can deal with the problem of desire if we don't own social relations for ourselves. The only other possible thing, because let me explain that, and then I'll give it to you for responses on anything. I have like 5 more pages to go through, but I've gotten to 2. It's just a really good article. Is the current form, so let me put it this way. Capitalism of the commodity form, as traditionally understood that Varoufakis is saying is over, deals with the problem of desire via objects, I'm going to say. So it's desire of the object. Techno-feudalism is presenting a desire of experience, which in a sense is actually drive. You're having because it never ends. So it's drive plus commodity. So classic capitalism was desire plus commodity. Techno-feudalism is creating a platform for drive plus commodity. But here's the problem. This is why the value form is everything. Because without a different valuing, I almost want to talk about a different way of valuing versus value form, then drive gets just plugged up into the value form, and you don't have the resources to take responsibility for social relations, because the social relations are still being mediated according to the logic of commodification. It just now it's got drive. And I know in your piece you talk about C to M to C becoming M to C to M, and that has the bad infinity structure that's going on. That absolutely is going on in techno-feudalism, and it is a way to actually have the drive get plugged in to the commoditized value form, which is way better than desire plugged into the commodity form, because eventually people go, wait a minute, the commodity doesn't make me happy. The gig is up, the jig is up. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. What if we bring in like the experience, self-realization, entrepreneurship? It's in a sense, it's a, dare I say, brilliant way to deal with the problem of desire by hooking the drive to the commodity form. But if drive plus commodity form, like, and I talk all the time about intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation for me, which I'm basically using synonymously with the drive in this conversation, to me, intrinsic motivation is necessary for the address of belonging again, but it's not sufficient. Like, it's a necessary but not sufficient, because you can be intrinsically motivated by the logic of capital, right? Or be your self-realization in a manner that is still making impossible the mediation of social relations according to an A-B logic, right? So intrinsic motivation or drive in of itself is not inherently good if it is usurped by the wrong logical form. So it's necessary but not sufficient, right? But we're right at it. This is the problem. Like, we're right now in this historical moment where, okay, we're seeing the need of intrinsic motivation. People call it passion, the need for meaning, the need for self-realization. That's all there, but it's still in the logic of commodification. It's still in the value form. I almost, and maybe I'm wrong about this, my feeling is that is the last of all possible steps before absolute knowing or death. Like, that is the final step you can take. And here you either have to move to absolute knowing, or you eat yourself, or it truly undergoes auto-cannibalism. That's my impression. But if that is so, then the problem is now all about the value form. Because we got the drive, we understand that, but we have the value, we have the wrong. I make a distinction between valuing and value form. I think that, and so we've got drive plus value form, but we need drive plus valuing, which I'm going to say in this conversation for communisation. It's a movement of valuing. That is needed for absolute knowing, and if we don't do it, we're in trouble.
Yeah, a lot there. So I really want to. I agree so much with you, and I think that's why I call it absolute capitalism, because we are at a tipping point. And I am very well aware that the term late stage capitalism has been with us for hundreds of years. And that Lenin talked about it, Mao talked about it, so many talked about it. But no, absolute capitalism is not only and simply temporal. It's a logic that is acted out, but it is also a certain. It really, bumps up or inevitably leads us to thinking the limitation of that logic. And so one of the things that I'm thinking in regards to communization is Zizek's war communism. And so during the COVID crisis, we know that I believe in America, all citizens or most got free money, like stored on their bank accounts. And there were all these measures being done all over the world that are basically unimaginable in a neoliberal paradigm, but they just happened. And now we just take it for granted, right? And so these type of measures, they show that in a way, post-capitalism is just for the taking. But at the same time, it's unimaginable and it's impossible insofar as it has not happened. But as soon as it happens, we are like, oh yeah, of course that happens. That's what humans do. That's what politics can do. That's so, and it's, the same goes for war, right? War is impossible. Of course, we are beyond war. We have blah 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 blah. So many reasons you can come until a nation state attacks another nation state, and we can see, oh, actually, war has always been here. It's not gonna leave us. And you are so naive for thinking that we can be in a global eternal peace. So this is really the weird structuring of I'm also almost tempted to say civilizational world spirit that just solve others in these waves, right? Like, and yeah, I think the attack, especially the attack of Russia in Ukraine, is such a good example of the West saying, no, of course it's not going to happen. He's just bluffing. He's just like a temperamental Russian, blah blah blah. He's just corrupt. And then it happens, and then of course it happens because he's evil and blah. So and that is like, so the change happens. In a way, we must be reflexive of the fact that these type of changes happen. Like what is impossible happens. What is impossible happens, and so I really like what you emphasized at the beginning in that it's about the third between people, not over people. This is really what I see as the meaning of Christianity in world history. Christ is not above you. Christ is among us. And so, and it is an impossible move, right? The word incarnate, that which is the highest, transcendent, heavenly, is here on earth, and there where no one is looking, and no one dares to look, no one wants to look. Christ is overlooked, right? But Christ is that, points to this responsibility of the in-between. But then again, Jordan Peterson is, as he says, a cultural Christian. With Peterson, it depends on his mood, honestly, right? Like, it depends on his mood whether he says he's a Christian or not, and that's fine. That's fine. He doesn't have to choose for me. So the absolute knowing is not just religionless. It's not just going beyond religion and leaving that aside, and it's not reason, right? It's not reason. But it is Christian atheism. It's in a way the truth of reason and religion in a unity, and that's what Cadell is doing with his book Real Speculations, is really working from that position of Christian atheism, right? That third that is in between, that Christ-like big other that exists, but it also doesn't exist. Like, you have to take it seriously, but also it's not the final thing. It's not the definitive answer. It's not the last vestige for our uncomfort to be relinquished, right? Which religion can function as, right? As a type of home, and this is the end station. So responsibility of the in-between is Christianity. Then Christian atheism is this type of absolute knowing that sees that it is a religious edifice is not enough to really get to the truth of the Christian gesture of Holy Spirit, one could say, of the Trinity. And from that position, real speculations are enacted, right? This type of writing out of context that is not about let's get to that over people, that thing that is over people, and then we just have to establish it and force it down. No, it's staying with the responsibility of the in-between, seeing the truth of religion, but also of reason, and also of spirituality, and also the lack in all of them. And yeah, this is like, I think that is, in a way, that is also proletarization, because these are all necessary for communization. And so to speak about Kafka and investigations of the dog, in A Voice and Nothing More, Dolar notes that in a way it's the missed encounter of the 20th century. What is the missed encounter of the 20th century? It's Kafka and Freud. Both were Austro-Hungarian, both were Jewish, both were obsessed with subjectivity, subjective destitution, all these self-cannibalizing, self-enclosures, those type of logics, dynamics of subjectivity, and they did not know each other. They did not know that they existed. And so in Investigations of the Dog, Dollar is arguing that Kafka is trying to find the language that psychoanalysis has basically, that psychoanalysis is, the discourse that psychoanalysis is. And so Dollar really like this. Dollar says it's the science of freedom. That's basically what the Investigation of the Dog is pointing to, right? Freedom, that's literally the final word in the last paragraph of that story by Kafka. So Kafka, in the West, Kafka has been read as a very tragic figure, but actually in Eastern Europe, Middle Europe, they read Kafka as a humorous, comedic figure, and that Kafka will proclaim freedom here at the end of a starved dog, right? For me, I read this. One of the ways I read this too is what I also take from Zizek, the idea that no salvation without starvation, no liberation without emaciation, and that is subjective destitution. that is absolute negativity. That is loneliness and not having the language to describe your state of being. That is like the only language that you have to describe your state of being in which you are addressed is that language in which you are not addressed. That is like living in capitalism and not knowing how to speak that it hurts, that it these type of things. But okay, so Cadell in his Marx course recently draw out the relation between Zizek's master thesis and my Communisation in Absolute Capitalism. And so in his master thesis, Zizek wrote when he was 25, 26, Zizek called for signifying practice. And to give an example of signifying practice, you can take the net or take philosophy portal. This is a signifying practice about orbiting subjectivity, working with address, working with not addressing each other, working with listening to each other, working with also not listening, working with talking too much or talking too little, like shyness, all these dynamics, right? And to the extremate core of identity. And so signifying real speculations, that is communization is a real speculation, but also signifying practice, that is also communization. So, but the immediate danger here is that we shouldn't say then the net or the portal or our community or our organization or our political unity, that is communization. We don't have that ground to work from, actually. Because as soon as we do that, we are already saying we who resist capital and then capital who is against us. And that groundlessness, the fact that we have to work from that groundlessness, like, we can say philosophy portal might be communization, the net might be communization. We might, maybe in decades and look back and see that they were communization. But maybe it's not the case. Maybe it's not the case. And we have to stay with that insecurity. And how to stay with that insecurity politically is explosive. Is explosive, right? Because in the nation state, who is going to vote for you if you say, well, you might vote on me, but actually maybe I'm not what I am saying that I am. Like that is. But this is also why I'm talking to politicians all the time from the right and the left who are in the city council or work in the Dutch state, and I'm noticing that I think the politicization of the nation state in parliament and election cycles has also meant the depoliticization of family and society. And I actually think breaking that apart and opening that, I think that's politics for me. I think you can, in a way, you can be busy with elections and the politics of the state and totally ignore the immediate politics of your own family life, of your own working relationships, of these type of things. And so communization does not allow for that. Communization doesn't allow for that. And that, but it starts with proletarization and the signifying practice that works from and has that at its starting position. So something that I also want to have very clear for the viewers is that communization is not a linear progress. It's not that once we'll do it, it will be done for us. Now, we will continuously be lodged back to ourselves. We will fall back to our own groundlessness, and yet we are responsible for the in between. And yet, we have to take religion seriously. We have to take subjective destitution seriously, because without signifying practice and seeing the immanence of what is spoken to you, how do we speak to each other, without that we lose the capacity to really formulate and cultivate the science of freedom, like Kafka is describing. And yeah, that is absolute capitalism, right? That is the end, in a way, the end station of absolute capitalism. Not because there's a beyond. Well, maybe there is, and maybe that's war. Like maybe the beyond of capitalism is actually a type of relapse into feudal relations or slave relations. As we speak, we are hearing Trump talking about one way to deal with migration is not to recognize illegals, but to say that the employer is still responsible for them. It's literally kind of a reversion to slavery, because you have people in your country who are not legal citizens, but they work. And of course, I know there's also a big black market. Tons of labor that is being done is done by illegal migrants. But to formalize that in your economy, that's really another step. That's really another step. And so that is really that really looks like a big regression to me from actually how capitalism has also been liberating, right? Which I really agree with you, and we should point that out, that capitalism as a third does emancipate us if it does not have any emancipatory potential. And so on the side of the commodity and desire to finish here, in the late 20th century, it became quite popular to critique capitalism's overconsumption, especially because in the East they did not have such a generalized commodity production for consumer ends, right? In the GDR, for example, you wouldn't have like bananas and melons and all these different things. Like if you were happy if you got like fresh apples, right, in the store, because that's what's being grown in the East, or things like this. But so but I think we should turn around and not only see the excess of overconsumption, but also see that capital relies on overproduction. And that's really basically the Marxist roots, right? What does overproduction result in? Here we start talking about lowering wages, right? The tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and its solution with financialization, Keynesian economics, war economics, and, as Varoufakis said, techno-feudalism. That is really, it stems from, you can call it an over-financialization of the real economy. In a way, it's an extraction, it's parasitic on the real economy, right? But yeah, that is where Varoufakis locates the genesis of techno-feudalism. It's in the 2008 crisis, and also how it has been repeated throughout the years. So, capitalism is a humongous contradiction, and that contradiction can be viewed from so many angles. One of the ways we can see it that I want to bring forth here is that capitalism, of course, needs people to be in wage labor. And we could say, well, maybe then communization is when we stop people from being in wage labor and we found communities that don't have wage labor. But the problem is that capitalism also relies on not valorizing labor, right? So, and which is maybe volunteer work, maybe domestic housework, maybe illegal labor, maybe open source community that relies on volunteers. There's even video games, man. Like video game mods are an excellent example of non-valorized labor that sustains the consumption of video games and keeps whole video games alive. So capitalism we can't just cease valorization. We can't just stop the value form and assume that then that is a liberation. It might be, but at the same time, it also might be servicing capital again. So, yeah, that is one of the contradictions that I want to point to here.
Oh, fantastic. So a few things. First, if there is indeed a tendency of wages to fall, then demand will fall. And if demand, because people don't have money to spend, and if demand falls, the system stagnates. So you have to somehow get money in the system. And one of the ways we've done it is through financialization by actually having the flows of capital separated by labor. So wages can fall and capital doesn't fall with it. But that also, following a Tyler Cohn, I do think actually creates stagnation, because then all of the growth is concentrated in areas where labor can be separated by capital, and almost by definition, that's going to be the realm of bits versus atoms, as Peter Thiel will say, and thus techno-feudalism. But then techno-feudalism seems to overcome the resource problem, because you don't have to be cutting down all the trees to be making your Instagram, right? Or to be playing video games. It's going to be using electricity. But then the funny thing is, renewable energy could be the ultimate shot in the arm then of capitalism, because then it can go on forever without using all the resources, and then drive plus value form, hey, it's good to go. So renewable energy could actually, if we're not careful, be the end of the game. That could be the end of the human, because it could actually then just be, because then you're the hope of transformation is always found in the encounter of limitation. When you encounter a limit, like we don't have unlimited natural resources, well, then we need to rethink the value form, right? Great. Or the other one that's starting to happen with like Instagram is burnout. I can't content create forever. And burnout is like, well, maybe this isn't going to work, right? So there's a way in which you hit the limit. In the same way when you encountered in earlier capitalism that the object can't deal with the problem of desire, you hit a limit and you start thinking of something new. But the capital nation state is always responding to those signals to figure out a way to keep drive plugged up to the value form without turning into valuing. Because, as I'm alluding to, the transformation of the value form to valuing is the sublation. That is the negation sublation. That is
I think
critical
I
to
just
all
want to add, I think in a way, value form is really, it's really that inhibition, like it really stops valuing.
Yes,
Right?
that's what I'm
It
getting.
really
Yes,
stops the
yes,
ability
yes,
to do that.
yes. That's the key, because the value form is a stagnant form, versus the key to forms in Plato are that they're forming, formulations. When they become a form, they become a thing and kill themselves. No different than saying this is communism kills it. Like this, it's the same thing. The problem with the value form is it names value per se. It gives it a name and then it's gone, right? Because, and this has a long lineage in theology. If you say what God is versus the likeness of God, you're in trouble. You're in heresy and you're going to be destroyed. You can never see God directly because that will kill you. You can only see things like God or approach God through analogy and metaphor. It's actually no different from about everything. The moment you name communism, it's lost. The moment you name Daniel, it's lost. It has to be the ever act. It's actually, well, this is where I'm obsessed with Korbosky, because Korbosky would basically say this. He'd be like, the moment you identify something, you kill it, because identification moves it to a stable state versus an unfolding situation. And basically what Korbosky is getting at is very AB. He's critiquing AA. He's very concerned with identification, and he's critiquing identification to be an open formulation. Everything is formulating, and be careful to name it, because once you identification, you freeze it and then it dies, right? And you're alluding to that, like, so there's a few things. You have that wonderful point toward the beginning.
That is the problem with the Communist Party, because
Yes.
then you say we are the Communist Party.
You're done. Game
that's
over.
really the problem I have with it.
The moment
it's
you
the
say
limit.
Yeah, the moment you say we are the Christians, you have Christendom, and Christ is lost. The moment you say we are the church, you're in trouble, right? And yet, nevertheless, there's a Holy Spirit. But the moment you say the Spirit is here, it's gone, right? This is the condition of the human being. That would be expected if absolute knowing was the case, because absolute knowing is the thing that as soon as you make it present is gone. It has to be in a lack, a present absence. Lack is not nothing, as Jock and I will say. It's not nothing. It is a present absence. So communism has to, in a sense, be a present absence, meaning it's an unfolding. Dante will say, that's why in Paradiso they're always dancing. It never stops. You know, the moment the dance stops, it's game over. You know, Inferno has a lot of algebraic point imagery. Once you move toward the Paradiso, it's more of an unfolding. It's more of a constant movement. The still point is God, and if you're still, you're dead. And if you name God, you're in trouble. Your wings better fail the lofty fantasy. There must be a still point that things are forming to, but don't ever name it. You can only be like it. You can only approach it. If you do not do this, you are in massive trouble. But this is a very difficult thing for the subject to think, but the argument being made is that if the subject can't think this, we can't get communization, and we better hope the commodity form doesn't fail, which it is. A few more things. You mentioned Kafka being funny. David Foster Wallace has a lovely essay on that in his book, Consider the Lobster. You talked about the science of freedom in Kafka. This is exactly right. All of Kafka is about freedom, and it's hilarious. Turns out freedom is pretty funny, because you find salvation when you starve. But of course, there's a very interesting tradition in religion where the only way to be a saint is to fast. The only way to, be rich is to give up your belongings. There's a tradition in religion where actually, no salvation without starvation. And one of the problems of Roman road Christian theology is you can be saved without starvation. And that's where it becomes a big other. Once you get a doctrine of salvation separated from starvation and sanctification, then you're in trouble. And you're probably going to lose the Holy Spirit, which I think has occurred. And you're not going to be able to mediate desire. The problem of desire will be with you. You'll have, if the only way to be saved, here's the funny thing. If the only way to be saved is through starvation per se, which is sainthood, then the only way to be saved is to actually tarry with desire. You have to tarry with desire. You have to tarry with the problem of desire, because you're kind of saying, I desire not to starve, but the only way to be saved is to starve. Therefore, desire is something I have to wrestle with. But if you can be saved without starving, then you can have a doctrine of salvation and religion that doesn't address desire, and therefore you get Paul Tillich. And you could argue that is what can occur in Jordan Peterson's religion, is that you can have a salvation without starvation, ideologically speaking, because you never question the economy. Actually, Jordan Peterson's whole thing is about doing well in the economy. So if you're a hero, you're going to be rich. You're never going to starve, baby. If you're starving, it's because the dragon of chaos got you. The idea that in starvation is salvation is a bit counter to that. Now, of course, Peterson, if he heard this, would slap back. He's like, I'm talking all the time about difficulty and facing challenge and, rising to the occasion. But here is my key point. Absolutely, religion in Hegel is hero fights dragon, risk, scary, etc., so forth. Absolute knowing is where the hero, in being a good hero, finds a dragon in their good hero-ness. That's very different than going to fight the dragon. That's where you find your very principles of the hero can actually lead to a new dragon. Actually, it turns out that the order of capitalism can create a new chaos called AI. It wasn't capitalism versus AI. It's AI is immanent to capital, and that's AB versus A versus B, right? So the key is that in Peterson, I do not see the idea that a hero, because they were a hero, became a dragon. In Peterson, a dragon is someone who failed to be a hero. In Hegel, he's like, no, actually, you can become a dragon as history develops and moves. The hero yesterday is the dragon tomorrow, Don Quixote. That's the key, is that there's a lack of Don Quixote in the logic of religion, if you will. You need that Don Quixote. And of course, how does Don Quixote deal with the problem of wanting to be a knight in a world where chivalry is no more? Crazy, hysteria. He convinces himself. Because the key, Harold Bloom points this out, Don Quixote knows that the civility is over. He's spending the novel trying to convince himself he doesn't know it. He's trying to enclose himself. The entire story of Don Quixote is an effort of convincing himself he's mad until he is. Well, that's what we all do. Everyone is Don Quixote now. It's a way to deal with the problem of desire, if you're not able to bring it to the between. You have this very important line. Instead of conceiving of communism as the stage that requires the traversal through the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism, communization already exists as the real movement of the liberation of value. And there's a way which we're describing as communization is, to use the language I've been using, the liberation of valuing from the value form. Okay, so likewise, that's a liberation of the human subject from identification to movement, ever situating, right? The ability to ever move, to not have a stable naming. it is incredibly hard for someone to never say, we're the Christians, we're the communists, we're the entrepreneurs. Like, to resist the temptation. Religions are always concerned about temptations. Turns out, identification is a temptation at this stage, actually. The temptation to look over his shoulder and make sure the wife is there, or Peter, look down at the water, now you sink, right? There's this idea that you have to always be in the thing, and being in the thing always tempts you to get out of the river, like the back of the Science of Logic anthology, right? Kant's out, Hegel's in it, right? There's always a temptation to get out of the thing. If you get out of the thing, you identify it and it's dead. So how do you create the kind of subjects that stay in the effing river and never get out of it? How do you stay in the river? That's what it means to keep the spirit in between. How do you do that? What kind of versatility of the subject is required? Well, I think it is found in the Communication Act. Training in, you're mentioning that, the ability to speak, to hold yourself. There is something about conversation that is uniquely a training of the subject in movement. And here's the key: unpredictable movement. I don't know what you're going to say. I have to be ready for whatever you say. I have to not get angry. I have to hold the space. Jacob Kashir yesterday was talking about hip hop. My beloved Bernard Hankins and I would talk all the time about hip hop and the need for schools to teach cipher mentality as opposed to binary thinking. And the idea is that the only way to really make it in pluralism is to basically for the average person to be capable of something like the cipher. Now, that doesn't mean they have to literally do hip hop, but they have to have the ability to enter into a space and create a certain field, a certain music in discussion that they're able to go with and just get in there. They might be scared. I don't know what I'm going to say. I haven't read as much as that person. I don't get all the references. Oh, what am I going to say? That's all the hip hop cipher. Like, when you have to go off the dome, that nervousness is what people feel in intellectualism all the time. Or when they feel, oh, I'm talking with, oh, I'm a Christian and they're an atheist. What if I say something and they get upset? Oh, I'm not going to get in there. It's the same sort of activity. The key is that the hip hop cipher, the music lubricates. The art lubricates, right? It allows a sort of, even if I say something that offends you, we know it's for the cipher. And here's the key: the cipher is more important than our personal feelings. Keeping the cipher, but even if I'm mad at you because you offended me with the dish, it actually is keeping the space. And if I get upset at the dish, everyone knows I did the wrong thing. I screwed up the flow because I got offended. I'm supposed to just understand that may occur, or somebody may say something I don't understand. And if I go, wait, what did you just say? Man, get out of here. The cipher is the third. The cipher functions as the third between. And it brings with it a certain implicit understanding of the rules that how we feel and our fears are not as important as keeping this cipher going, right? I strongly, Bernard and I would always associate the cipher with the Holy Spirit. It is absolutely the Holy Spirit. And when you listen to people who do freestyle rap, they associate it with Holy Spirit, this sort of presence. That is a conversational act. And basically, cipher mentality is very much, and Jacob was pointing this out, and I think it's true, when someone like Vervaeke talks about a dialogos or circling or different things, there's something like that is going on, a similar sort of cipher mentality that is being brought on. But here's the issue. Well, can dialogos save the world then? Can cipher save the world? Is that enough, right? How do you have a cipher mentality outside the cipher? How do you have the cipher mentality outside of the music? Can you hear the music as you're doing your dishes? Can you think in terms of cipher when you're dealing with someone you disagree with? And in fact, someone you think is evil. Because here is the $1 million challenge to everything. When Jesus says, love your neighbor, who is the neighbor? They ask him, who's the neighbor? And he gives the story of the Good Samaritan. And there's, of course, this question of who's the neighbor? Is it the man on the side of the road, or is it the Good Samaritan? Oh, by the way, a Good Samaritan for the Jewish people is a contradiction. Samaritans are the bad guys. There is no such thing as a Good Samaritan. So when Jesus is like, love your neighbor, it's tied to love your enemies. Oh, screw that. I'm not going to love my enemies. That's enablement, right? There is a suggestion that Holy Spirit requires a ability to love your enemy. Oh, and your enemy is someone who wants to kill you. Not just someone you dislike or who has different interests from you. Someone who wants to kill you. How do you do that? How do you do that? What does this mean? Aren't you going to like lay down your life and die? Yeah, well, that's what Jesus tells you to do. What? But there's a suggestion that the cipher is more important than your life. The geopeitic, the Holy Spirit, that it is more important than your life. But how can you genuinely believe that? That seems very, very difficult to do. A few more things. basically, before I forget, it also seems like unless you yourself are a vanishing mediator, it is inevitable you will give into the temptation to identify or name. If you don't position yourself in communization to be a vanishing mediator, it's only a matter of time before you say, we're the communists. If you in Christianity don't try to position yourself to be a vanishing mediator, then it is only a matter of time before you say, we're the Christians and they're not. So the ability to make yourself the vanishing mediator seems strongly connected to the ability to not fall into the temptation of identification, which is necessary to keep the thing open. But then, of course, how do you make yourself a vanishing mediator? Well, you have to believe the cipher is more important than you. You have to believe that the Holy Spirit, in the Zizekian sense, is more important than you. How do you do that? Well, what we seem to be suggesting, also tied to this point that you made that's so important, that I don't think I actually finished, that I started, was that Hegel never finishes the totalizing system. He's revising all his life, he's going back, right? Well, right there, that's so important, because what seems to be a totalized system is actually for Hegel valuing, not a value form, per se. Because there's a way in which a totalized system is a kind of value form. It's a kind of, here is the form of value, and if one were to simply participate in this, they would thus have value in the proper way. They would actually be able to value life in reality in the proper way. But of course, then there's an exchange logic there, because you wrote the system, you exchanged it to me, I did it, so there's an exchange value. That's actually an operation with the totalized system, right? So Hegel is like, nah, I'm just ever valuing. And you need to, if you're going to read the science of logic, you, reader, need to be revising it forever. You need to be always going back. Well, that's basically what Cadell is doing in his performativity. He is absolutely like Hegel going back and saying, well, let me change this. I can definitely tell you, I have so many papers from so many years that I'm like, just no, it's not, no, redo, right, redo. How could I have been so stupid to have written that? And you go on and on. So there's something about drive. It seems to be the only way to put the cipher above you, per se, the Holy Spirit above you. I have so many notes. Is that you have to have drive plus valuing, because the value form gets in the way of valuing. Okay, so drive plus valuing seems to be the condition that puts someone in the place to basically maintain the third between them is more important than them. So the between becomes more like and it's not really, well, this is the tricky thing. This is why I always talk about self-forgetfulness. It's not that you say my life, like you literally are degrading yourself. You're literally trying to humiliate yourself. You forget yourself in the between. You forget yourself in the Holy Spirit. It's about self-forgetfulness. It's not about humiliation or self-deconstruction. It's about forgetting yourself, right? And it would seem that drive plus valuing is how you get a self-forgetfulness that creates the conditions of possibility for, well, communization. That is community precisely because it is never identified as such. It is the ever dance, the ever activity of itself. The number one threat, and this is why I think religion, this is perhaps the secret, well, the ability that religion has that is very important. The number one thing is that's going to go all good and well until you have to forgive someone. Until someone hurts you, until that person on the other side of the between makes you upset. And I will definitely say that I think there's been an underappreciation in how religions have doctrines of forgiveness. That is actually, in my opinion, more important. You see, well, let me explain this. The whole afterlife stuff is secondary to the forgiveness stuff. In fact, the afterlife stuff is motivating the forgiveness stuff. And this is really important. We have not figured out how to have forgiveness without a big other. Like, we've not done that because it's too hard. We can forgive people like us, but also that's tied to forgiving them because they are like us. And if we don't, we have to disavow our very worldview. But when you start having to forgive people that are very different from you, or who hurt you, or who are energy draining or upsetting, why would you do that? Why would you freaking do that? Well, fascism wins then, because then everyone goes off and they form their own sort of self-identification and we have a problem. Well, you may do it if God says you'll go to hell if you don't, or, hey, you don't forgive them? I died on a cross and went to hell to forgive you. So you're going to have to get over it. Oh, by the way, love the Samaritan. What? Do it, right? One of the other reasons why the doctrine of salvation from the Roman road without starvation is so problematic is because one of the key ways you have to starve yourself is on the substance of not forgiving someone, which is self-righteousness. Identification. We really don't want to starve ourselves of identification. We get a whole lot of energy of identifying ourselves as the Christian or the communist or the capitalist or the Republican. We get a crazy amount of motivation from identification. Nope. You have to remove that energy, because you have to not see your identification as meaning you have status. Because here's the issue. One of the reasons we don't want to interact with people different from us is because if we can other them, then our identification gives us status, and status creates energy. It creates motivation. Status, if I feel important, I have more motivation. And of course, what we want to ultimately enjoy is desire of desire, not a thing. We want to have this kind of self-turning wheel. Status can give me that. And if I'm saved and other people aren't, I can have some energy to get out of bed in the morning. I can have a certain motivation, right? If I start forgiving or seeing the other and identifying with them, I threaten that source of drive. That I threaten that source of energy, because I can't get a certain motivation from feeling like I have a truth that other people don't. We're the communists, and that can give you the revolutionary spirit creates drive. Yes, we're going to fix everything. Please.
It's so good what you're saying, and I think this is where proletarization is located.
Yes.
Because proletarization is about returning, and also communization. But it's that indeed there is perhaps that's really also a good way of describing the illusion of progressivism, honestly, what you just said. Because progressivism is that status building through not having to engage with the other who is against that very notion of progress, right? Because, hey, man, we live in 2025. You should know that. That type of thought is very perverse, I think. So, in my life, I know people who say that Israel has no right to exist. I also know people who say that what Israel is doing is not only okay, but it is great. I also know that these people, when they would, let's say, meet and talk with each other, it would be explosive. And the first thing they would do is probably just not talk and get out of each other's way. If not, they would destroy each other, right? That is really the stakes of this today politically, right? And I bet, like in the United States, it must be very tense with Trump today. Like, did you vote for Trump or not? Maybe there's people who voted for Trump also were disappointed with him, but then maybe their family was against Trump, and maybe then they have to come back to the family and say, yeah, I kind of regret it, and maybe they are ashamed of that and therefore do not say it, because then I'll look weak to my family if I'm indeed kind of saying, yeah, maybe it wasn't so good. Like, these are all the things that I hear when that I hear when you speak, that I think about these type of things. And Zizek says that without signifying practice, freedom is lost.
Yes.
We can just do away with the whole notion of freedom, because then we don't have to think about it if we set signifying practice aside. And I think the net and the portal, they're really great examples of signifying practice that are tied in with the contemporary ecology of thought in different ways, right? So Christians and communists can be perverts. What a surprise! You can indeed, and what you're saying, it's so right. I'm always a little bit trying to hide that I'm a communist. I don't want to say it, I don't want to say it. I don't want to say yes, but I'm a communist.
Yeah.
So I think that I don't want to say that, and I think Don Quixote is such a it's so present today, and I think there's okay. So if Zizek has written a book against progress, so there is anti-progress communist, and I would categorize myself as one of those. And what is kind of left then is conservative communism, or at least the communism that is that doesn't want to turn its eye to the conservative gesture, right? And I mean, personally, I'm following right-wing politicians and also right-wing pundits and analysts all the time. And I'm also learning a lot from right-wingers, whether it's about the economy or whether it's about social issues or whatever, what have you. And so, but the danger, I think, with conservatism, populist right, the more reactionary, also the fascist, the problem is that it is really like a Don Quixote. And I think Peterson is also in that camp, because this type of let's unearth the library of holy scriptures and then start justifying the present state of things with that, right? Like, it's your fault if you didn't, it's like it's your chaos if you didn't raise yourself to defeat your dragon, like it's your fault if you don't succeed in this economy. The thing with that is it justifies the present state of things and it calls itself conservative, but it is actually progressive.
Yes.
It is actually progressive.
Absolutely.
And that is the perverted drive of capital is progressive. And so communization as a type of conservative communism really asks the question, okay, we are in this default trajectory at which it seems that capitalism is at the zenith of its logic. It seems to be hitting its limit. It seems that more and more war or civil war or class war or real war or trade war seems to be exploding, right? There's all these enclosures, and like if you don't have to say anything to each other, it's either you go away or you use violence, right? You collide physically.
Yes.
So the question that I am really bringing to this article is, can we avert that? Can we have a political revolution that is a social revolution, which is communization, like to avert our default trajectory? And I'm giving it away, like to call out that default trajectory, to basically say we're fucked. Like that is hysterical. That is hysterical.
It's hysterical.
And so it's not an answer, right? It's not like, oh, that's like we just have to say that all the time. Like alarmism, we don't have to be alarmism. Alarmism itself, right, can be a way to really avoid thinking through something. You can the whole day you can look up all the tragedies that are happening all over the world, and then what are you doing? You're feeding the algorithm. You're going to your wage job. You're coming home. You're tired. You're looking at your feed. What's happening at the world? Oh, I'm feeling even worse, but at least I'm not thinking about my job or like things like this, right? Like this. Yeah, it is. It's really like it's a catharsis. It's a release, right? It's or like a catharsis. I mean, it's a catharsis to like see the horrible feed and to see what type of news is coming out in it. From your job and from capitalist dynamics. So, oh man, we are in an explosive position. And what you said about the cipher. So I cipher in like philosophical way or discourse way is like a signifying practice, and then this type of cipher. In the end of my article, I believe the last paragraph, the title of it is "Universal Political Mobilization." And I said it with in the podcast with Daniel Coughlin, and I'll say it here again, that what I've seen with communist radical leftists is that they'll identify with one of these terms, and then they will not really think about how do we actually think its universal ramifications from the position from which we are working and thinking right now. And the reason they don't do that is because as soon as you do that, it all collapses. Like, let's be honest, like a global cipher, like that's what communism is. It's a global cipher in a way.
Yes. Yes.
It is. That's and what is that? That's madness. That's ridiculous. That's impossible. That is crazy. And but that is the
thing.
That is the thing. Like that is what we have to think to even think to begin to think capitalism and our position, right? It's not like we first think our position and then we think the global cipher as communism. Like we have to think the global cipher as global communism, global in pluralism, right? And that is like there's a loop with that and our singular position, right? So it's not that's the big transcendent thing over there and we are insignificant, but the collective will do it for us. The movement will do it for nobody will do it for you. You can have tons of mass movements, they will not do it for you. They're true expressions of true frustrations. That is true, and we should take it seriously when people are rising up. Even if that's for left or right wing, that's secondary. So so that's to have this type of loop of thinking the global and the plural but grounded in the groundlessness of the singular. We'll have to be coming back to that repeatedly, and that's the work. That's the work.
That is 100% aware. Basically, yes, a global cipher is ridiculous, impossible, but it is the thing. And in a cipher, there is a singular universality that Cadell will talk about. Because every cipher is one of one, and it brings, and what happens in a cipher? Every cipher is inseparable from the particular people there, because what they bring to the cipher, the associations they make, is them. You could actually argue there is no, and we were talking about this yesterday, there is no other speech that is more you than the improvisational speech, because you can't fake improvisation. Like you can fake a script, you can fake something you're thinking about what you're going to do, but the improvisation, you cannot fake it. Improvisation is the only authenticity in a way. Like it is the only way to be authentic is the improv. But of course, here's the issue. This is the $1 million problem. Well, how do you have improv without chaos? Because this is the problem with cheap to lose, as I like to say. Okay, you've got your authenticness, but it's chaos, right? This is where art is so important, because art is, but particularly improvisation art, not the art object, but the phenomenology of the artist itself, what you do in the creative act. That's what I always want to emphasize. There's been too much talk about the art object and not the act of creating itself. The phenomenology of the artist is really important, because in the act of writing a story, you have no idea what you're doing, but you know exactly what you're doing. And the cipher, you don't have any idea what you're doing, but you also have a structure because you have to follow the beat. The order is the relationality itself. What you are saying is based on what the other person said, of which could have been something else, but now that they've said it, it's a necessity. The cipher is a live contingent necessity, all in operation. And then what you say that you know is contingent, based on how the other person responds, retrospectively turns it into a necessity. Like, because they pick it up as if it could have been nothing else. They make the effect as if it was all. So a cipher is contingent necessity, which is the only way to actually have freedom, right? Because otherwise, like, that's a Hegelian freedom. It's you're identifying with limit. In the cipher, I'm identifying with what they just said. I'm not going to tell them that was a bad line, because that kills the vibe, right? And the person who responds to you knows, I better not stop and say that was stupid. It kills everything, and then that person will be hurt. Like, we accept the limitation of the contingent improvisation of the other that we will now treat as a necessity. We are going to treat it as a limitation, and our freedom will be found if we all do that collectively. That is freedom. Anything short of that is not freedom. It's either chaos, or it's brainwashing, or it's you can't have freedom where there's identification, because there's a framework that over-determines the freedom. How do you have a freedom that is determined but not over-determined? That's the only way you're getting freedom, is that you have, because if you have no determination, it's nothingness, right? So you have to have determination. How in the world do you get freedom that's determined and thus possible, and not chaos, but not over-determined? The phenomenology of the artist. It is only in the artistic act. Every other framework is going to fail to maintain determination that doesn't slip into overdetermination. It's going to eventually become identification and close the system, right? So what is an activity that can maintain determination without overdetermination? Well, there's going to be the speech act. Good thing that most people are talking all the time, so the possibility is there. We just have to change the quality of it. Well, how do we change the quality of it? Well, that gets into that. But the cipher is absolutely a structure of actual freedom, of real freedom, that is determined but not overdetermined, because it's determined by what? The other. Oh, and how is that determination of the other arising? As a surprise to the other. We experience our determination that we're doing to the other person as a surprise to ourselves. Where did that come from? I don't know. So we experience our determination that we are doing to the other as an act of freedom to ourselves that is in response to another determination. So we don't experience ourselves as determined in the improvisation. We experience ourselves as free, but in the relation, there is a relation of contingency and determination. Thus, we have actual freedom. So if you want freedom, it's going to be like a global cipher, and nothing short of that will suffice. But of course, the question becomes the following. How do you do it? Well, the zenith of capital. So you mentioned the zenith of capitalism. For me, the zenith of capitalism is AA drive. I'm just going to put it that way. Drive that is still within AA logic. And that's what we have now. That is the defining feature of techno-feudalism and financialism. All of this is basically AA drive. And it's a separation. Cadell put this very well. I really liked how Cadell talked about it in his talk with Tim Adlin, where he talked about the dream of capital and the dream of labor. And there's kind of this separation of those two things. I think that's the dream of capital is unemployment, where capital can flow without labor. And the dream of labor is to follow your drive without worrying about capital, right? Without worrying about financial, right? Basically, that split can't be brought together in AA drive. Because what you're doing is basically saying, okay, drive over, you can have labor over here separate from capital and there's drive. We have no idea how you're going to economically sustain yourself, but you can have your drive over there, right? But it's not going to contain in it the way to get capital or something. You're not going to have the dream of capital appear in the dream of labor per se. AB, it's going to stay over there. Or you can have your dream of capital, which is never going to fulfill the dream of labor. It's just going to be AA, right? But both of those have a drive to it, right? But it's not an AB drive. Because to do that, you'd have to what? Change the entire socioeconomic system. Well, dang it. And that would be communization. Communization is AB drive. The zenith of capitalism is AA drive. You can't go beyond that. That's religion without absolute knowing. Communization is AB drive. So the question is the following. How do you create global AB drive, which would be, for me, a global cipher, and it is absolutely tied to signifying practices, hip-hop mentality, so on and so forth. So for me, there are three main principles here that have to be thought. And before to read from your wonderful paper, I have no idea where the time's going. Who needs to go to work? Okay, so according to communists, or actually, this is the communizers, Marx's critique of the value form had practically never been taken up by the communist movement. Democracy in the workplace, as well as centralized planning, both leave the capitalist mode of production untouched, okay? So this is important. And then you have here, the term form is crucial here, value form. So you say, Marx was critical of political economists who took the form of value for granted and went straight to its content, which is labor. Marx was concerned about the form, what it does to the content, on how labor and its products take the form of quantifiable expressions, like commodity and money, which are both prerequisites for the capital form. It would be difficult for me to express how much I agree with this, because the capital starts with this question of how do people come to believe that a chair is worth $20? There's a socialization that occurs that is a value form is created, or else labor can't be an abstract social use at all. And, you know, I know Catrone, I believe his teacher was Pastone, who is big on the value form as well, and I'm very big on this. There's one more line here. Also, too, another issue is that you mentioned there is a non-class society. Well, one of the reasons why communism hasn't been able to do the global cipher is because the global cipher, as we're describing it, would be a non-class society, right? Well, if there's no such thing as a non-class society, then what we're talking about is communism can't be. It has to be the proletariat gets the means of production, and you get a universal class. You can have a universal class, but you can't have a non-class society. Well, the universal class is AA. Like, we're all universal class now. We're on the internet, aren't we? I mean, the techno-feudalism is about as close as you get to a universal class as you can get, because even Elon Musk is at the mercy of the algorithm. We're all at the mercy of the, you know, that's about as close as you can get to a non-class society, is when we're all being controlled by the Nick Land singularity. So that's not very good. There was another line. You say something like, I have it underlined somewhere. Basically, the problem is we haven't taken the value form serious. The liberation of, I have it somewhere. You get the point. The idea that I so strongly agree with is that we haven't thought the value form. And if you don't think the value form, then anything you're going to do is problematic. So for me, the way that we move from value form to valuing, which isn't, it would be basically we have to do these three things. So you have to spread drive, which seems to already be spraying, actually. Capitalism itself, with the techno-feudalism, is helping spread drive. It's just problematically, it's AA drive. But there is something there that's kind of, this talk of meaning and passion is actually kind of helping that. The problem is assuming drive is enough. Drive is necessary, but not sufficient, is how I like it. Intrinsic motivation is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you have to spread drive. The second thing you have to do is spread the act of valuing from the value form. So the act of valuing, the capacity to engage in valuing, has to be spread. Belonging again to is going to call that the meta judgment, the ability to judge the framework in which you are determining values. It's not just judgment, but you're also judging the way by which things you value. So the meta judgment. Maybe there's better language, but that's what I call it. So you have to spread the meta judgment. The problem with the value form is it captures all judgment of value. and thus it is overdetermined by the commodity form, right? So you have to spread the capacity of valuing distinct from the value form, right? And critical to this means you don't actually have to go make a point to destroy the commodity. This is very important. Like, if you had to literally erase the value form, well, that would be you'd have to destroy capitalism. But if you change how people engage in valuing, here's the key. The system actually then has to serve those people, not just the commodity form. This is how you revolt capitalism from the inside. You change the quality of demand. This is why Belonging Again 2.1 is obsessed with the creation of demand. If you change what people want, well, then capitalism has to change or it goes under. So it will. So if you can change people to valuing, you change the quality of demand in the system. And since supply has to respond to demand, capitalism can have a revolution that is a reformation intrinsic to itself. So change the value form to the act of valuing. Well, how do you do that? Well, I do think that's strongly tied to signifying practices. I think what Zizek is getting at is that this is why I'm big on the social coordination mechanism. This is why I want to bring back oral testing to school. I want to get rid of the trivia education system. All of this is about increasing probability of the spread of signifying practices, where people are actually more putting priority in the speech act versus the memorization confirmation, which the entire school system says to you that a smart person has the right idea. They don't engage in a live speech act. The current education system is anti-cipher. It's the opposite of a cipher. This is one of the reasons why I think many black communities feel kind of left out by the school system. Yeah, because their culture is more on the side of hip-hop, improvisation, cipher. The reasons for that, Bernard and I would have many talks on, but you definitely see jazz improvisation. There's an emphasis in minority communities with improvisation in America. And that also makes sense if you feel like the norm doesn't allow you into its logic. Well, then what's the alternative to that? Being able to improvise on your own because the normal logic is actually just oppressing you, like Charles W. Mills in Blackness Visible will talk about that. So it would make sense that what is outside the Foucaultian norm would err on the side of improvisation, because you got to make it up as you go if the norm is not for you, right? So this makes sense. But unfortunately, the school system, and being made in the image and likeness of the AA zeitgeist, is actually hindering cipher mentality in favor of binary, which is going to facilitate in favor of the value form, right, instead of valuing. So there's education reform. I think intellectual property rights have to be reformed. There are many more things I can say. But there are ways, there are very practical legislative ways to help the movement from the value form to valuing. Ergo, the meta judgment is another term I will use. But here is the third leg of the stool, and this is a very difficult one. Unbinding the act of forgiveness from various enclosures. We're pretty good at forgiving Christians in Christianity. We're pretty good at forgiving atheists in atheists. We're pretty good at forgiving and relating with difference and difficulty within our structure. Can we unbind forgiveness from an enclosure and actually have it be across worldviews? How do you forgive across worldviews? Because they don't even agree in the axioms or the premises of value by which you define forgiveness. They don't even think they need to be forgiven. Because that's a power move. You're forgiving me of something I don't even think was wrong. So F you. That's a power move, right? But then at the same time, it's like, well, I shouldn't forgive them because they're immoral. And actually, if I forgive the immoral people, that's enablement. So I better not forgive. That would be against justice. The problem of forgiveness in the metaxis, the between space, is the true test of absolute knowing. Because that is abyssal. There is no other act that is as abyssal as forgiving across worldviews. That is the most abyssal act of all. Because it's one thing to believe there is no God, God is dead, and reality is abyssal. It's another thing to commit an act, because if you feel like there are people you can't forgive, now we have to get into what is forgiveness, because the Jew forgive the Nazi, that gets into the Sunflower Book. We get into all sorts of stuff. But here's a problem. If there are people we don't forgive, there actually is a big other. There still is a big other, because there's a meta law. You don't forgive those people. So if you truly want to get rid of the big other, if you truly want the Father to die into the Holy Spirit, then there has to be the ability to forgive the unforgivable. If you cannot do that, there's a big other. And thus, you're not dealing with a global cipher. Well, does that, Daniel, mean the Jew must forgive the Nazi, or that the family must forgive the murderer? Like, where are the limits of that? Are you saying there are no limits to that? What are we going to do? Well, look how abyssal it is. And look how abyssal it is. You're looking for a meta law instantaneously. Like, forgiveness is absolutely The ground of freaking absolute knowing. That's why like it's right there in religion is all this talk of the problem of forgiveness. Well, forgiveness in religion to people who share the religion is hard enough. Christians who hurt each other forgiving is hard enough. We are talking about the forgiveness between religions, between goods. If it's between ideas of the good, how do you talk about that as good? Because it's in the between spaces of ideas of the good. How can forgiveness be good in that space? How could you possibly do it? Well, you have to have, well, ultimately, this is why I do think it gets tied to beauty, because the only way I think we can actually go through with the suffering of creating the conditions of possibility for a global cipher is experience of beauty, of which until this historical moment was not necessary. But now I think it is necessary, and only beauty will be sufficient. But now we have to get into why beauty, and does beauty emerge actually in this radical lack of any sort of grounding, but the pure self-givenness of forgiveness when it can get you killed. That is uniquely positioned to create an experience of beauty. And I think in our historical moment, the globe needs, you went through a period where truth was sufficient, say the Enlightenment, then you've gone through a period where the good was sufficient, the commodity form, and now you're in where beauty is sufficient, and beauty is weird, and we don't understand what it is. But if we can't do it, we're not going to have a global cipher. And I do view the Paradiso of Dante as an image of a kind of global cipher. You have this dance, you have this worship, praise that's going on, and you have this still point. But I'll give it back to you.
Yeah. Thanks again. I'm really loving this conversation. We're talking about a lot, and yeah. When I started writing this article, it was meant to be a response to real speculations. The whole part underneath where I say communization for the first time, like that was like, I was like, oh, that's gonna be a little addition, but actually it turned out to be the biggest part of the article, and what the whole article basically revolved around, and that's how I want to write. I want to surprise myself, astonish myself, laugh at myself, be terrified at myself too, of like, oh my god, did I just say that? I did not want. I did not. I don't think like. And then you start not knowing what to say to yourself, right? And so, who am I writing this article to? I'm super grateful that I have readers like you, like others. But I think this is like, in a way, I don't have an audience. I don't assume an audience. I don't assume they're communists. I don't assume they're whatever. I write and I don't know exactly what it is I'm writing to, and I don't also know exactly what it is that I am saying, what I want to say, and where it is going. But I want to not fall into relativism. I also want to not fall into this type of answer of desire that all we have is to fail and then we strive to make the best thing out of it. I don't think that's the final answer to. And so what you are left with is this type of drive, and not a perverted drive, not an AA drive, but an AB or emancipatory drive that keeps returning to itself, because it's in a way it keeps obliterating itself, right? And in Philosophy Portal, Cadell was having a lecture and he was talking about my article, and then Edie came in and she asked me to explain the term, and then I asked her, "Is this clarifying to you?" And she told me, "Oh, I thought you said, is this terrifying to you?" And she said, "Yeah, it was." And at that moment she said this, I was like, "Yes, thanks." Like I did what I wanted to do. And here I'm like, Marx's critique of the philosophy of right. He is saying we have to teach the people to be terrified at themselves. We have to sing the people's own song back to them. Doesn't this, in a very weird, to paraphrase what you said about beauty, in a very weird way align with what you call the cipher? Like, we should read this weird quote by Marx with this weird way we're talking about the cipher, as this, like, this weirdness of the aesthetics, the being terrified, right? Like, it's not, the cipher is like you're being shoved because your body's like, do it, bro, you can do it. And you're like, well, I had, like, I'm so tired, I didn't sleep well, I had a long day, I had I had like a conflict with my girlfriend, and then you just do it, and maybe you surprise yourself and like start being everyone's like, oh my god, what the fuck did this guy just do? And you don't even know what you did. But it works like this. It can work like
Yes.
this. That's really the cipher type of dynamic that that and I listen to tons of hip hop, so I'm thinking of all these examples in songs of rappers saying things like, you know, first nobody acknowledged me, nobody recognized me, then I started doing rap, and all of a sudden they see something in me that I didn't even see there, and this type of thing, right? That's the object A, the object cause of desire, but not as a final object, but as that which keeps the drive going, the object cause of the drive too. And so if Hegel, then why Marx? I would like to bring this to this conversation. If Hegel with the dialectic, if Hegel with religion, absolute knowing, forgiveness, and all that, then why Marx? And so a radical argument that Zizek brings in his it's in the sublime object of ideology to a big extent. It's in probably in all his books to be found, but it's that what Hegel didn't see is that his speculative logic, or like his real speculations, you know, Hegel's speculations in the sense of his system, they were already operative, but not simply in Hegel's mind, but in the very movement of capital. In other words, capital is a speculative monster. Capital is a monstrous type of spirit that is it's a concept that is totally abstract. It is real at the same time, and it comes up against its otherness to sublate it and to make it align with itself, and it can totally align it with itself, or it can leave it at its other, but still to extract from this other to keep itself going. And so I really loved what you said about changing value form from within capitalism, like the move from value form to yeah. So before saying that, like this whole, like the talking about the value form, I understand why the communist movement didn't take that up, because it's so like if everything hinges on that, you want to avoid it, because it's like fuck, it's like total closure in a way, right? If you really face up to the problem, but like it's a closure also because we don't have the language and the know-how on really how to tackle it.
Correct.
So to just say this, it's a very simple thing of like value form to valuing, but within capitalism, that is really, to me, that's another way of putting communization in absolute capitalism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Like that's really what I'm trying. And so in the article, since you're also obsessed about the value for you probably did see that, you know, it's not simply about liberating wage labor and getting away from value, but it's also about what are the capitalist dynamics at hand that are already in place, and what is the emancipatory potential of these dynamics, instead of just pretending it doesn't exist, distancing ourselves from it, like these type of things. And so that is where you start seeing that, okay, if you take the financial sector, it is capitalist and it is not capitalist in a way that, like quantitative easing, like printing more money, like it's at the behest of the will of whoever decides to do that, right? Like the head of the central bank, who is of course the government says to do this. But and so is this really capitalism or not? Well, in a way we don't have a way to see it, but at the same time, like this is absolute capitalism, because it's the limit of capitalism within capitalism that we don't know exactly where it might go or where it will go once we have a different let's say framework, or a different relation, or a different a different way of treating this. So that's really also the level we have to think, not just like trying to distance and get rid of capitalism, but think, okay, we're within capitalism, value form to valuation happens within capitalism. And then what you said about the speech act, I think you're saying, I don't know if you're already doing it, but I think I'm hearing more in what you're just saying, because the speech act is of course a technical word, right? It's not just a word of like you say something. The speech act is really a word from like intellectual traditions, and it's so the speech act is also about I wrote an article about Spinoza, and at the very end, I'm basically saying that Spinoza is, you could see him as a philosopher of the speech act, but I think Spinoza is a philosopher of the speech act that stays with the AA drive. That's, to me, the problem with Spinoza. And I tremendously appreciate Spinoza, and I think he's super great to read, so not demonizing him at all. But the speech act of Spinoza is basically saying causa sui. In other words, self-causing cause. It's not just what is said, but it's also who is saying it, namely, for Spinoza, substance, ultimately, right? His system doesn't hinge on subject. It's substance as substance, which is the system, it doesn't need to self-differentiate into embodied subjects, because that would, that's the contingency that we can just wave away. We don't have to address that. So, but the speech act is really seeing that substance and subject always come together in not only what is being spoken, but also the position from which it is. So whenever I come to you with, hey, Daniel, I have a great idea, it's like, it's not only that I think I have a great idea, but also I think I have a great idea. Not, right? It's not just, it's about like, well, okay, why am I interested in that great idea? Why not another idea, right? So to be able to really think this dialectical logic of substance to subject, that is also a way to understand proletarization as the precondition, or like as being intimately bound up with signifying practice and therefore communization. And so the speech act is really the singularity of the necessity of that singularity. And so one more thing about the whole Hegel Marx thing, the fact that I think, I don't remember the name of the who came first with it, but there is this idea that the Kantian categories and whole Kantian philosophy is actually Kant's unconscious, unreflexive description of capitalism as how it works. So what is happening there with Kant is not that Kant just has great ideas, or Hegel's genius has great ideas, is in his ecology, reads a lot, as the cipher, but no, like, in a way, the cipher or the philosophical corpus is, reflexively or not, expressing the fundamental logic of material conditions, material reality, the production, or like you could say industrial production and the reproduction of human beings. These two things, right? And so the accumulation of and the logic of capital, commodities, etc. And so that is really a wild short circuit that Zizek really tries to bring to the cipher, so to say. But this is why, if I will just get this book, so I like Lukács, and you know, Karl Korsch, Lukács, they really were adamant about, if you are Marxist, read Hegel. Lenin also said it time and time again, right? Like Marx said, don't treat Hegel like a dead dog. He hated it when people thought you could just, do this. But for Lukács and Karl Korsch, I believe, you could say it with Marx too. Hegel is, to put it in overgeneralizing terms, Hegel's the best liberal thinker, but he's not a communist, and he's not a communist. Why? Why is Hegel not a communist? Because of not seeing how his speculative logic is always already active as capital, which is a kind of, it's a kind of reason of itself. So this is, this is that kind of Hegel, turning Hegel upside down, right? So, and this is also why I think at the bottom, like, Cadell is doing the Marx course. It's not just like Marx is an expansion back to Hegel. Marx really changes the entire way we read Hegel. So yeah, that to speak about the radicality of Marx. Yeah,
absolutely magnificent. I have work. I am so upset. I will have to go in 10 or so minutes, but this, and it's the tyranny of this, but this has been completely magnificent. But a few things, and then if you have any final things to say, please. I've tremendously enjoyed this. For me, there's a way in which what I'm calling here AA drive is the zenith of capitalism. And far from actually a mistake of capitalism, this AA drive, this moment of crisis is actually, that is the most capitalist thing, is AA drive. That's why when we say Keynesianism and quantitative spending, that's not capitalism. Real capitalism is free markets. Well, that's the limit that you're disowning. So you're not owning the limit. No, no, no. The need of quantitative easing in capitalism. Keynes, it was very interesting. Keynes always said that he was a capitalist, but that he believed capitalism was unstable. He wasn't a communist. He didn't like Marx at all. He was more socialist, but he didn't even really like the term socialist. He was more like, no, I'm a capitalist. I do think capitalism is the best system. It makes people rich, but it's unstable. And there's something about that position that is kind of more of the truth almost, is that, yeah, capitalism is unstable fundamentally, but that is capitalism. Capitalism is a certain instability. But that would mean its greatest accomplishment is AA drive, where it can make the instability endless, where it's driven. The AA is fundamentally limited. It's always going to be eating itself. AA is fundamentally auto-cannibalistic, and yet you can be driven by auto-cannibalism. That is the zenith. That is the crown achievement, to find a way to be driven by auto-cannibalism. Doesn't get any better than that. Except not for us. That's the Kafka move right there. It's the best you can possibly be, but you're not a bug. You know, it's the best that can possibly be, but not for you. That's that key idea that, what does Kafka say? He says, oh, of course there's a heaven. Of course there's salvation. Of course there's eternal bliss. Just not for us. And that's kind of that move that's funny. And so, yeah, AA drive is a drive of auto-cannibalism, but it's not a very satisfactory meal when the snake is eating itself. Cannibalism is not that pleasant. But it's not a mistake. And if you think quantitative easing and all of the interventionism to keep the system going is not capitalism, you're disowning the limit, and therefore you're going to keep going. You're never going to engage in the negation sublation. So this is very important. So AB drive would be the communization. That would be the actual negation sublation. And so then, if that is fundamentally contingent upon moving the value form to the valuing, then that is the move. That has to be done. And I think what you said also about the Speech Act is exactly right. The Speech Act is not just saying the word cat. It is the situation of speaking that entails relationality and then wholeness of experience. And so the global cipher is a speech act. It is not merely speaking, but it is a condition of speaking, of which then changes the quality and the subject in the speaking, et cetera, et cetera. And also critically, okay, how do we use the dynamics of capitalism that are at play? If you say, basically what is being suggested is that any sort of thinking of subtract dynamics, subtract capital, get rid of capital, that's not going to work. Subtracting and negation are different in this sense. Like, negation is a certain using the thing on itself to negate it into a new quality. That's like the sublation has this sort of, the thing references itself in a manner that leads to its negation, that then turns it into something else. That's not mere subtraction. Most revolutions have been subtractions, and therefore failed, because it's always in the capital nation state of core autonomy, right? So what is the dynamic of capitalism at play? Well, this is where, yeah, markets are currently serving quote-unquote demand in the image and likeness of AA drive. So if you can take the dynamics and serve instead a demand that's made in the image and likeness of a B drive, well, then those dynamics could help you. What would it look like for those dynamics to help you? Well, the market would suddenly have to create spaces of gathering. It would have to support philosophy portal. It would have to create places. It would become architectural. It wouldn't become about objects. It would become about spaces. It would be about facilitating relationality and helping people train the subjectivity to handle it. You can imagine the market becoming a marketplace, dang it. Because ultimately, AB capitalism, like the market would, like, it was something, actually, before I forget, a reason I actually think this is not impossible at all is because I actually think, like, a huge amount of the market is just creating places for people to gather and talk with one another. Like, how many restaurants are there? What do people do when they go to a restaurant? They talk. What do people do in the park? What do people do when they go out to drinks? You could argue a stupid percent of the capitalism in the service industry, and please note that capitalism, as it becomes a first world nation, tends toward the service industry. A very, very high percentage of the service industry is about facilitating spaces of conversation. That's what they do. Do people go to restaurants primarily for the food? If you do, your girlfriend will not be happy. You go primarily out to eat for the other person, right? Yeah, there's movie theaters, but people do what? There is a very large percentage of the system that simply provides spaces where people can freaking gather. So it's latent. It's there, right? AB Drive would increase the demand for spaces. Spaces that create vibes, that are able to create modes of engagement with the subject and help people be subjects with one another. So capitalism would move from, I like to say, it would move from object to horizon. It would move into space making, to the ability to have a certain sort of mode. Capitalism would have to help people have modes of being, not merely things within a mode of being that is isomorphic to AA Drive. So you would change what people wanted, and thus you would change how the market behaved. Much more would have to be said, but I do think what you were getting at is exactly right. I will give it to you for final things. But of course, the $1 million contingency of all of this is the problem of forgiveness. Because if you can't do that, then people will fragment off into small fascist states. Basically, it's either small, without forgiveness, it's going to be small fascist states or a totalitarian overlord that runs everything like AI. The choice is between small fascist states or AI singularity that runs us all. Which would you like? If you say neither, then we have to figure out the problem of forgiveness. And well, the last thing I'll say is basically this is also where I think beauty is a big deal. Because one of the reasons I think people do this kind of work is because somewhere in your life, you had the taste of an experience that was only possible because you do this kind of work. Like you've had conversations of a certain quality with people who read philosophy that then convince you, actually, yeah, doing this kind of work actually is worth it because you've tasted certain experiences that you remember that keep you doing it, right? Like if someone were to actually ask you, Dimitri, why do you do this? You say, well, I have good conversations. And they're like, you could have good conversations without philosophy. Like if you just tried to explain it, it'd be really different. Why do you do hip hop? Because I like music. There's lots of music. You have to do it to get it. Like, why is Hegel in the river? We'll get in the river and find out. I won't get in the river until you give me a good reason. Then you're damned. This is also the problem with explanation. Like, if you need a reason to do, this is the curse of reason, actually. Like, if you need a reason before you do something, well, then the things of which by definition cannot be given a reason, you will be cut off from. And a world without the beautiful and also the arts and philosophy is one in which people only do things if they have a reason or a purpose. And this is where purpose is a problem. And that means you never do the things that may provide qualities of experience that speak to a different mode of being that's actually higher. So it's very important to be able to operate not just by reason, but you could say faith. And faith, of course, is courage. And faith is courage. Faith is not, like the word faith in the Bible is way more tied to pristeh, which means courage and faithful. We've already talked about this. I think faith as dogmatic belief is a big mistake. The only way to actually encounter the beautiful or certain qualities is a certain courage. To do it even if you can't explain it, right? Well, that quality of experience then helps you do it in the future because you've had experiences, if you have interactions. Likewise, if you've written a novel and you've experienced the beautiful, then you know, let's put it this way. If one time in your life you experience the beautiful, then you know it's possible. And if it's possible, that can guide you, right? And so if you have experiences that you know are possible, that can help actually motivate you to do that which otherwise seems stupid or difficult. This is why ultimately I think beauty and the problem of forgiveness are going to come down to one another, because the only reason you would forgive someone that you have no good reason to do and they're different from you is because for some reason you believe that increases the probability of an experience of beauty that's worth it. If you've never had a taste of that, then why would you do it? And this is where the taste of the Holy Spirit is big. This, though, on the relation of forgiveness and beauty and the problem of forgiveness in the metaxis, which by definition can't be good, because good is defined on sides of the betweenness in worldview. So if you're talking about forgiving between, you're talking about a forgiveness that's not good. It's not a good forgiveness. We know how to do good forgiveness, but we don't know how to do non-good, not bad forgiveness, but non-good forgiveness. The only way you would do that is if you've tasted the beautiful. This is a very, very big deal. I think about it all the time, but I'm out of time. But I want to give you the final word, and this has been too much fun. Dimitri.
Yeah, thanks. I want to give an example of what I've recently seen of forgiveness or solidarity as is coming from this true forgiveness, as you've put it. And that is, there is people in Israel demonstrating all the time about the havoc that is being wreaked by the IDF in Gaza, and they're holding pictures of Palestinian children who are dying, 4 or 5 years old. But then I've also seen pictures from Gaza with Palestinians holding pictures of Israeli children that have been kidnapped by Hamas as a response to those Israelis showing Palestinian children, and then the Palestinians showing the Israeli children. And that is, yeah, it's beautiful, right? Like it's impossible, but they are doing it. It's impossible. How can they do this? Probably they're getting a lot of shit from it, from maybe people around them, if not people on the internet, of course, the comment sections. And it's so fragile, and it's so powerless, so powerless. And it's like, how is this going to help? I can already see like people, like being like, how is this going to help the cause? But this is like this gesture. This is everything, right? Like this is really everything that is at the heart of being in this state of madness, of war, and somehow these people have chosen to do this, despite everything, right? Despite everything. So that's, yeah, that was. I saw that, and that really that really shocked me. So on like communist identity, so I am a communist, and that means that people think lots of things about that. But to me, it's I'm a communist because I want to think war, I want to think capital, I want to think family and society, and I know this is why I am a communist. I know that every starting point is a presupposition. Every starting point from which you think is already a presupposition, which means that in a way, perhaps every starting point also has its own inherent blind spot. So, being a communist, to paraphrase what Lenin has said in an article that I cite, that I said in my article, is that you have to keep returning to first principles all the time, because they will be obliterated. Like as soon as you step out of it, you start making steps. As soon as you think this is the first step and you make it, maybe it turns out, well, it was a false step, and now you're back to nothingness. And like how does one become a communist? I think it's really like love, because I think it's as Zizek describes it, it's not that you choose, okay, now I'm in love with her, but it's like, oh fuck, I'm in love, damn it, like I did not take this into account. And then maybe you can say, well, am I being overdetermined? No, I'm not overdetermined by capitalism. But I think this is there is a way in which thinking about these things, sometimes I get the sense of claustrophobia, just as one would have when reading Kafka. Or also, honestly, I feel that too when I read Hegel sometimes, that, oh God, like we're in this movement and we're in this logic. And either I take it I take it up, I assume it, I accept it, I go with it, or I say, no, I'm not determined by it. But I think, no, like, we can say, no, I am determined by capital. I am over-determined by capital, and I don't know how to deal with that. And I'll think about, and I'll try to try to get out of that. But the only guarantee is that I'll keep coming back to that point of not knowing what to deal with it, being over-determined by capital, total enclosure, not wanting to acknowledge that, saying, no, I'm not over-determined, and then saying, yes, I am over-determined. Like, to me, this is really to return to this. That's in different ways, right? In ways that is singular for each person. This is really the core of the emancipatory drive, and this is politics. When people will come to you say, no, this is just your personal thing, it's not politics. No, it is politics. And that doesn't mean shove politics in their face, especially if they are not ready for it and things like this. But no, like that side of powerlessness, that side where you don't really have a way to go, maybe no political party, organization, ideology feels like it addresses you, you feel lonely, like that is the political. That is
Yes.
the guarantee of the emancipatory drive that you will keep returning to, because that the perverted drive is like, it's very perversion sounds maybe like in a way like perverted, it's like maybe like masculine or something, but the perverted drive is actually very flimsy, it's actually very fragile, it can't really face much, it's and the emancipatory drive like this is in a way it's without without like you meaning to return to it. So yeah, thanks so much for this conversation. I'm really glad that you that my voice was being heard, and that we can have a conversation that I feel is so urgently needed, and to not only do philosophy but see philosophy as a political speech act. To do this together is, yeah,
It's been
it's grateful. Thank you.
it's been a complete delight. Everyone, I highly suggest the article, Actual Spirit. Just a few things. On that idea of ever going, I identifying with the determination, not seeing yourself above it. There's this kind of humbling, this certain, Heidegger may say nihilation. There's always this kind of cutting yourself. Basically, that for me is the necessary training if there's going to be any possibility of forgiveness, of forgiving the other that you see as evil or bad. Because only by ever knowing in the practice of, questioning yourself, identifying, stressing a certain like weakness, if you will you actually perhaps be in the position to do the forgiveness? Because forgiveness at its hardest is going to feel like a certain weakening, a certain cutting off. Like you're going to feel very weak. You're going to feel like you should strike. Castration, almost. There's going to be something in there. Castration and the kind of forgiveness is tied together. And I think those practices are tied together. But then, of course, there is evil that could be manipulating you. So forgiveness, it would be another topic. The three points metaphorically, we have to think the dove, the lamb, and the serpent. And these are very tricky. The dove is connection, the lamb is sacrifice, the serpent is wisdom, which is tied to self-defense. These three have to be thought, and they have to be thought for the possibility of forgiveness. But without beauty, I don't think we can think them, because one will go too far on one side or the other. Now, this is opening a can, and I'm out of time. This silly thing called time. I think the emancipatory drive is anti-fragile. Basically, it seems as if there are three main points that we've touched on. That, again, is my bias. The problem of drive. You have to deal with drive. You have to move AA to AB to get AB drive, and we have to think forgiveness. The subjectivity that is going to be able to move through these steps, these developments, is one who has probably had an experience of beauty that will give them the kind of fortitude to do the work of these three. And that is the work of a subject that is childlike, spirit child, that if spreading childhood were accomplished in these terms, could be the possibility of a global cipher, which would be the emancipatory politics. It would be the fruit of an emancipatory drive, in so much if it is never identified as such, because that would close it and it would be dead. So you'd have to stay in the dance at the still point, the wheel turning on the wheel. The final thing I will say, and then jump, is what you were stressing of the impossible. It does very much remind me of my dear Benjamin Fontaine. He was Jewish. He died in a concentration camp. He was a student of a man named Levi Sestan. And both of them work together basically to say the following: the human needs the impossible. Without the impossible, they die. And actually what Fontaine argued is that Nazism was rationality without impossibility. It was radically rational. And basically what both of them were warning is that politically, without the rational, you're either going to get, well, a massive totalitarian state or a bunch of broken up fascist states that go to war. The impossible is the possibility of avoiding one of those fates. And the impossible as such is theopolitical. And of course, Fontaine took that to the concentration camps. And to me, the impossible, if everything we're saying sounds impossible, this bringing of drive, AB drive with forgiveness afforded by beauty for the possibility of a global cipher, if that sounds impossible, And that's exactly what we're hoping for. So we will continue with the impossibility. Dimitri, always an honor and a pleasure, sir.